I apologize, I'm a little late. Welcome back, everyone. Can I have one of those? Well, it is indeed a pleasure to welcome our second invited speaker. Matthew Novenson is the Helen H.P. Manson Professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary. Matt is also an honorary fellow in the Faculty of Divinity at University of Edinburgh, where he was before he came to Princeton. There he held the chair of biblical criticism and biblical antiquities. He earned his PhD and THM from Princeton Theological Seminary. His research includes religion in antiquity, ancient Judaism, ancient Christianity, biblical studies, New Testament, the Apostle Paul, Messianism, Christology, hermeneutics, history, and theology, theory, and method. Is there anything you don't know? His monographs include Christ Among the Messiahs, Oxford 2012, The Grammar of Messianism, Oxford 2017, Paul Then and Now, Erdman's 2022, and his newest work, which is really good if you haven't read it, Paul and Judaism at the End of History, Cambridge University 2024. And his paper is titled, and I hope I don't mess this up, Apokatastasis in the Letters of Paul, and I'm really excited to hear this paper. So welcome, Matt. Good to have you.
All right, it's an honor for me to be with you all. It's good to be at CBA. It's good to be hosted by our colleagues at Villanova. So thank you all for hosting, and thanks to Archie and Josh for bringing us together. There's a handout that just has primary text that Josh is bringing around. You don't need it. It's the texts that are already printed in the paper. You have the paper pre-distributed, but I'm going to read some excerpts sort of strung together that will give the gist of the argument. And then we'll have time to discuss. Okay. One hopes that Origen of Alexandria, having died some 3 centuries earlier, was untroubled by the Emperor Justinian's anathemas of 543 and 553. Among the quote-unquote Origenist ideas condemned in those anathemas, some of which can plausibly be traced to Origen, others not, is Apokatastasis, a Greek word used approvingly by Origen and expressly condemned in both sets of anathemas. Thus, the 9th anathema of 543 reads, if anyone says or holds that the punishment of demons and impious humans is temporary and has an end after a certain time, or indeed that there will be a restoration or apokatastasis of demons or impious humans, let him be anathema. And the 14th anathema of 553 reads, if anyone says that the set of all rational beings shall be one, their hypostases and numbers having been abolished along with their bodies, and that with this knowledge about rational beings, there follows the destruction of worlds, the setting aside of bodies, and the taking of names, and that there shall be an identity of knowledge with hypostases, and that in this fairy tale or mythical restoration or apokatastasis, there shall be only bare minds, as there supposedly were in their nonsense talk pre-existence, let such a person be anathema. Now, the first of these objects to the prospect of the restoration or apokatastasis of demons and impious human beings, as opposed to the idea of their eternal punishment. In the second, the objection is phrased in more general terms, the fairy tale or imaginary apokatastasis. But the cutting edge of the latter anathema has to do with the claim that what survives into this restoration are gymnoi noes, bare or disembodied minds. Now, Origen arguably did hold to the idea that punishment was temporary. The business about the disembodied minds is more complicated and probably not, doesn't stick exactly to Origen. But The term apokatastasis, the term of offense, Origen did not invent. He found it in the Gospels and Acts. He read Jesus say in the Gospels, Elijah comes and shall restore all things. Apokatastemi. And he read Peter preaching in the Acts of the Apostles, repent so that God may send the Messiah appointed for you, Jesus, whom heaven must hold until the time of the restoration or apokatastasis of all things, about which God spoke through the mouth of his holy prophets from of old. So Origen reasoned, not implausibly, that there must be such a thing as an apokatastasis, ponton, a restoration of everything. But while he found the term in the Gospel and Acts, Origen found what he took to be its explanation in the letters of Paul, who does not use the word. And above all, in the discourse on the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15. In his commentary on John, on the phrase enarche in the beginning, John 1:1, Origen contrasts arche and telos, beginning and end. And he writes, the end, telos, comes in what is called the apokatastasis, on account of there then being no one left as an enemy. If indeed it is true that, and then he quotes 1 Corinthians 15, he must reign until such time as he has put all his enemies under his feet. But the last enemy is eliminated, namely death. For then there will be one activity for those who've come to God because of the Logos, with God, namely comprehending God, so that they all, having been formed in this way in the knowledge of the Father, may properly be God's Son. That Origen understands the apokatastasis to include everything, as per Matthew, Mark, and Acts, is clear from the way he coordinates it with 1 Corinthians 15, 25, and 26. If Christ puts all his enemies under his feet and then eliminates the one final enemy, death, then it follows that no one is left as an enemy. Now, this conclusion depends on one interpretive decision about these verses in 1 Corinthians, which is plausible, though not necessary or obvious. Whereas interpreters have often read Christ's victory over death in verse 26 as just the last instance of Christ's victories over many foes in verse 25, Origen distinguishes between the subjection, tithemi hupo or hupatasso, of all the many enemies on the one hand, and the elimination or nullification, katargeo, of the last enemy, death, on the other. Everything else is subjected to Christ, put in proper hierarchical relationship to him, such that those things are no longer enemies, rather they are reconciled. The only irreconcilable enemy is death, perhaps on the logic that death is eo ipso foreign to God, hence it must be eliminated altogether. Only then, once the whole cosmos has been reconciled to God and the lone irreconcilable thing eliminated, can, this is the quote from Paul that Origen wants to explain, God be all in all, onta en posse. All right. So to talk about this end, as Origen saw, you have to talk about the beginning. Now, I used to think that regarding the origins of the cosmos, Paul's view is roughly as Stanley Stowers summarizes it here, quote, Paul's basic conception of God is that of an incomparable cosmic emperor who rules within the universe that he made from pre-existing matter. Stowers writes, this openly anthropomorphic understanding of God and other gods is impossible to square with Stoic, non-anthropomorphic doctrines, end quote. Such an anthropomorphic view, Stowers writes, and he rightly argues, is assumed in many of the Jewish scriptures that are Paul's principal sources, and it well fits Paul's own many anthropomorphizing descriptions of God. God creates, God is a king, God has a son, God has enemies, God gets angry, God loves, and so on. If then Paul were to imagine the moment of the creation of the cosmos, then perhaps he would picture an omnipotent, anthropomorphic demiurge fashioning everything that exists out of tohu wabohu, or katasteuston, or perhaps hule, although Paul never uses that Aristotelian term. But Matthew Sharp has recently argued, alongside but differently from George Van Kooten, that Paul expressly articulates the view that the universe proceeds or moves out of God, ek theou, and not that it was made by God, hupal theou. And the idea of procession out of God is a classically Stoic one. One key Pauline text in this connection comes from the doxology at the end of Romans 11, which praises God for his inscrutable wisdom because, Paul writes, ex autou kai di autou kai eis auton ta panta. Everything moves out of God and through him and into him. The key point for the most immediate purpose here is that tapanta, all things, come ex autou, out of God, not hupautou, by the hand of God. Paul says the same in 1 Corinthians 8:6, hemin hestheos hapater ex hutapanta, out of whom all things come. And again in 2 Corinthians 5:18, tarapanta ek theou, all things come out of God. Nor does Paul ever anywhere use a different formulation like this for the generation of the universe. Now, as is well known, from the classical period onward, there was widely current a conventional use of several Greek prepositions with cases to mark possible cosmological relations amongst the highest God, the demiurge, the forms, logos, matter, etc. This is sometimes called prepositional metaphysics, although that phrase is overwrought and potentially misleading. But the linguistic convention itself is attested already in Plato's Timaeus and Aristotle's Physics. And by the early Roman Empire, it's quite well established. Different philosophers and schools differ on to what or to whom they assign which relations and on how many relations they recognize. But the relations themselves, as expressed by these prepositions and cases, are pretty standardized. For instance, Philo of Alexandria writes in his Cherubim, God is the cause, not the instrument, the aition ou organon. That which comes into being is brought into being through an instrument, but by a cause. For to bring anything into being needs all these things, the by which, hufu, the from which, exhu, the through which, dihu, and the for which, diho. The first of these is cause, the second material, the third tool or instrument, and the fourth the end or object. A century or two later, Alcinous writes in his own Platonism, if the world is not such as it is by accident, then it has not only been generated from something, ek tinos, but also by something or someone, hypo tinos. And not only this, but also with reference to something, pros ti. But what could that with reference to which it is generated be other than the forms? Therefore, forms exist. But whereas a Platonist like Alcinous distinguishes sharply between the by which, hufu, and the out of which, exhu, Stoics generally do not. On their account, God can be both agent and material. Hence the Stoic cosmogony, ek to theou, out of God, from God's own self. Now, the reason this is often not thought in conjunction with Paul is that Paul elsewhere speaks of God creating the cosmos, ktizo, and ktisis. And interpreters of this latter idiom have often taken it to imply a sharp ontological distinction between creator and creation, God and cosmos. Richard Balcom, for instance, famously has written, Paul's phrase, all things, in these formulaic texts we've been mentioning, belongs to the standard rhetoric of Jewish monotheism, in which it constantly refers, quite naturally, to the whole world of created reality, from which God is absolutely distinguished as its creator and ruler, end quote. For Balcom, talk of creation, if you use those words, then entails an absolute creator-creature distinction and rules out any possibility of Stoic-style panentheism. But to say what Balcom says is actually to beg the question, because it doesn't attempt to understand how a thinker such as Paul might say and mean both that God creates the cosmos and that everything comes out of God. But that it is possible to say both is evident from the fact that Stoic sources do say both. They say that the cosmos comes out of God and returns into God, and simultaneously portray this as an act of divine creation or making. Thus, in Diogenes Laertius, he describes the cosmology of Zeno and Chrysippus in this way. They, the Stoics, use the term cosmos in three senses. First, it is God himself, the individual being whose quality is derived from the whole of substance, who is incorruptible and ingenerable, being the creator of the cosmic order, the demiurgos, tes diokosmesios, who at certain periods of time reabsorbs all substance into himself and again generates it out of himself. And further on he writes, God, the Stoics say, is a living being, immortal, rational, perfect, or intelligent in happiness, unaccepting of any evil, like Ben Sira 15, exercising providence over the cosmos and everything in it, but he is not of human shape. He is, however, the creator, the demiurgos of the whole, and as it were, the father of all, both in general and in that part of him which pervades all things, diakon diapanton, and which is called many names according to its various powers. So God is the creator, but God is not ontologically distinct from the cosmos. Quite the contrary, he generates it and pervades it and reabsorbs it in Stoic cosmology. If the idea then that creation entails an absolute creator-creature distinction, that idea would have come as news to the Stoics, is my point. Now, you might think with Aristotle that the cosmos is uncreated and eternal. But if you think that God created the cosmos, then you basically have three options. Either God created out of his own substance, or out of hule, or pre-existing matter, or out of nothing. As for Paul, there's an interesting debate whether he might imagine a creatio ex nihilo, but on balance, I think not. The evidence is pretty slim. There are two possibly relevant texts. Neither of them is about cosmogony at all. In 1 Corinthians 1, Paul writes about God's preferential option for the weak. God chose the ignoble things of the cosmos and the nothings, the non-things, in order that he might undo or nullify the things. Perhaps more relevant is Romans 4:17, where Paul speaks of God making the impotent ancestor Abraham a father. Just as it is written, I will make you a father of many nations, Genesis 17, before God in whom he trusted, who makes the dead alive and calls non-things as things, to me onta hos onta. But even here, cosmogony is not expressly in view. And calling the non-things as things is not the language of creating or making or generating out of. So I do not see secure evidence for creatio ex nihilo in the letters of Paul. But despite my initial impression mentioned above, there's even less evidence for creatio ex materia, creation out of hule or matter in Paul. So we might imagine, as per the Stowers quote, that Paul assumes an anthropomorphic God creating out of formless stuff, but Paul never actually says that. Whereas he does say several times, tata pansa ek to theou, everything comes out of God. Now, where is this God? Next section of the paper is where Mark Smith says he is. That's that. That's a few pages I'll dispense with.
I don't believe you.
So Paul has a Stoic-like account of the generation of the cosmos out of God's self. But Paul does not draw the Stoic corollary that God is diffuse through the cosmos, because rather God is in heaven, in Paul's normal idiom. Nor, a fortiori, does Paul say that God is the cosmos, which is what the Stoics say. For Paul, as for many of his Judean forebears and contemporaries, God dwells at the top of the cosmos in the uppermost heaven, from whence he rules and executes judgment. And this is important. Judgment because in another instance of Paul failing to draw Stoic inferences from Stoic premises, Paul thinks that the current cosmos is disordered, estranged from the God who generated it, in need of reordering or reconciliation or subjection before it can finally resolve back into God. As Emma Wasserman at Rutgers has argued, this is not a matter of good versus evil, but rather of divine politics, of the proper ordering of all the various gods, powers, and elements of the cosmos under the authority of God. God sent the Son, Paul says, to do the work of subjecting all these unruly powers and elements to himself, in order ultimately to hand the rule, the basileia, back to God. at which point, finally, God can be Ponta and Passin, all in everything. Just here, John Barclay has rightly emphasized the mismatch between Pauline and Stoic theologies. Barclay writes, the differences go very deep. It is absolutely essential to Stoic theology that the present cosmos, while causing pain at the individual level, is providentially ordered to be the best possible context for human well-being. Even the conflagration, when it comes in Stoicism, will result in a reestablishment of the same cosmos, with the same elements, in the same configuration. God or reason or nature is fully immanent within the cosmos, guaranteeing its order and cohesion. End quote. For Paul, by contrast, speaks of the cosmos needing to be reconciled to God, of the creation needing to be freed from its enslavement to decay. For Paul, the present age is emphatically not the best of all possible worlds. There is such a world, but it only comes into existence by a new, different ordering of things. It does not follow inevitably from the fact that everything comes out of God. Now, likewise, despite his very Stoic-sounding cosmogony, everything coming out of God, Paul's eschatology is also not consistently Stoic. In one respect, actually it is, in that just as Paul says all things proceed out of God, so also he says all things go into God, eis ton theon. Thus the final clause of Romans 11:36, hodi ex autou kai diautou kai eis auton tapanta. All things move into God. As Van Kooten has emphasized, this fits, and as Origen saw, this fits with another Pauline summary of the final state of the cosmos, 1 Corinthians 15. When all things are subjected to the Son, then the Son himself shall be subjected to him who subjected all things to the Son, so that God may be Ponta and Passin, all in everything. The phrase itself, Ponta and Passin, may allude to a saying of Anaxagoras, the pre-Socratic, but as Paul uses it, it describes an eschatological state of affairs where everything resolves into God. And this is what caught Origen's eye. Many modern commentaries balk at this idea when they write on this phrase, Ponta and Passin. C.K. Barrett writes, this has to be understood soteriologically, not metaphysically. It is not the absorption of Christ and mankind with consequent loss of distinct being into God, but rather the unchallenged reign of God alone in pure goodness, end quote. Maybe, but it is Paul's form of words that raises the specter of metaphysics. And Barrett doesn't offer a counter-argument, only a claim. And as Runar Thorsteinsen has said, we might have our own good theological reasons for siding with Barrett, but Paul does write what he writes, so that God may be Ponta and Passin, and this does sound pretty classically Stoic. But what happens next is not, because following the Stoic conflagration, or ekpyrosis, when everything resolves back into God, the cosmos is reconstituted. And this is what Apokatastasis means in Stoicism, the reset of everything as it was last time around. Second verse, same as the first. The cycle repeats itself in perpetuity, like a great divine rhythm of inhaling and exhaling. For Paul, by contrast, there is no recurrence. New creation signifies not the recreation of the cosmos as it was, but a new and permanent state of affairs. And that state of affairs is not what we usually think of as a creation, that is, an ordered arrangement of things. There's a parallel ambiguity in Paul's way of speaking about cosmos, which means an ordered arrangement of things. In 1 Corinthians 7, giving a rationale for the renunciation of sex, marriage, procreation, property inheritance, etc., Paul writes, parage gartos schematu cosmututu, for the form of this cosmos is expiring, passing away. The notion that the cosmos has a schema, or form or pattern, is likewise explicit in Stoic sources, like Marcus Aurelius. Paul agrees with the Stoics that the present form of the cosmos is expiring, but he disagrees with them that what happens next is that it will recur. Something else is coming and is now here, but Paul never calls that something else a cosmos. He calls it the kingdom of God, or the new creation, or life everlasting, while Origen of Alexandria, for his part, calls it the Apokatastasis. That's all, and I would enjoy discussing with you. So thank you.
Great. Question?
Thank you very much, Matt, for your paper and for this very interesting subject here. There's a lot of thoughts come to my mind, but I just wanted to know.
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, dude, Father Chris Morcone, St. Charles Borromeus. Have you looked at Ben Sira? I mean, of course, I love Ben Sira. It's in chapter 48, verse 27. He says, though we speak much, we cannot reach the end. And the sum of our words is, he is the all. So my question is, you did a very fine job in tracing Stoic thought and relationship with Paul. Someone was mentioning before Paul, the rabbi. To what degree do you think the texts such as Ben Sira, others, would influence Paul's thought rather than from a Stoic point of view? This came up when I was doing some research on the issue of free will in the ancient world. And oftentimes scholars just look at the philosophical underpinnings of texts of the New Testament and then patristic thought as well. But I rarely see them look at some of the Deuterocanonical literature and rabbinic sources to address the same issues. I just wanted to know if you've come across that in your research, and if so, how does it influence your thinking now?
Yeah. Yes. Thank you, Father Chris. I have come across, I haven't come across Ben Sira 48 in this connection, so that's very helpful. The question you raise is a perennial one, that is, if artificially for the purpose of this paper, Paul is the center, right, then what counts as relevant context for Paul? And it's an occupational hazard and a commonplace in New Testament studies that people are usually like, they either learn Jewish stuff or they learn classics. And I've tried to learn as much of both as I can. I try to tell our students, right, in terms of possibly relevant contexts, it's never right to think in terms of an either or. Paul, it's certainly the case that in terms of literary influence, scriptural, meaning, right, holy Jewish writings are overwhelmingly the most influential on Paul, in that he maybe cites a few non-scriptural, like Jewish scriptural references, maybe, but he quotes mountains of scripture, right? So he does not. Well, he never cites clearly Ben Sira. I would not at all be surprised if he knows and draws on Ben Sira and other sort of later Second Temple texts. That would not surprise me in the least. I'd be interested in hearing what you think about what that means in Ben Sira 48. The difference between the two, I think, is it's not simply a declaration of sort of God's sovereign relation to everything. The difference between the two is that Paul uses this language of, well, with the prepositions, it's the language of motion, right? Out of, through, and into. And that's what raises, this is why I have a quarrel with like that, with the commentaries, with Kingsley Barrett's comment, is it's Paul who's using language that's cosmogonical and eschatological. So it's not wrong to ask. Paul is not remotely a card-carrying Stoic, but he's arguably, his language is more Stoic than it is Platonist, which is the dominant philosophical influence in later antiquity and therefore in most of ancient Christianity, which is why I think it's worth kind of reopening some of these questions.
Oh, thank you so much. It's interesting because most of the time to see people focus on the early Stoics, Zeno and James Chrysippus, and then jump right to Paul and overstep with the reception because all of those early Stoics are so close to Ben Sira and others around the Deuterocanonical period, It seems essential if you're going to track the development of something, theological idea or whatever, that it not jump over that period, but kind of go through and see how it develops and then how that's. So thank you very much.
Swedish with Villanova University. Thank you so much for this very fascinating paper. I have a question about Romans 8, 21, 22. In 21, Paul talks about the decay that creation is subjected to. But 22, then Paul says something. We know that the whole creation has been groaning in labor pains until now. And I want to just speak to the metaphor here, the imagery of labor pains. If we take this seriously, that a mother is going to give birth, well, to something that looks like a human, right? So something like a new creation that looks like the old one. So is that not, counter to the argument that the new creation will be just magically totally different?
Well, that's a good question. I don't think it's either magically or totally different. I don't think that's the but the crucial difference is that it has to be incorruptible, whereas the present is corruptible. And it's not total because it is still, right? It is still itself, right? In the resurrection, those who rise are those who have died, and so on, right? There's it's the identity is preserved. So it's not total in that respect, and it's not magical. It's by the power of God that it happens. So, yeah. So I don't know that I disagree with anything in your question as I'm understanding it so far.
So it's this new creation, like Paul's view, is both similar and different. So if one were to live through that eon, right, into this new eon, one would actually recognize the new creation because it's like a woman giving birth. But it's, as Ben said, it's still a new creation because the corruptibility is all on the wayside.
Yeah. Again, I don't think I disagree with any of that, and I don't know that Origen would disagree with any of that. Actually, I mean, he, in as much as in Origen's Apokatastasis, even more so than in Paul's like new creation account, Origen's very precise about the creator-creature distinction perdures and the distinction between Father, Son, and Spirit perdures. So this is why it's kind of ironic that Origen is posthumously anathematized, because in some of these respects, he's actually bending over backwards to preserve certain sort of theological distinctions that are crucial for him that we also think of as orthodox, broadly speaking, in ways that Paul may agree, but Paul's does not explicitly like preserve those things as clearly as Origen does. So
Thanks.
Paul Danove, Villanova University. I have a question. I have not read the Stoics in Greek, but in Latin, and half a century ago, so my memory is way out of date. But wouldn't even Stoics call God Pan, or Pas instead of Panta? I mean, why would you use a plural there? That just seems to be very peculiar to me that they would use the neuter plural instead of a singular there.
yeah, I think you're right. So I don't know of any such. I don't know of any source, Stoic or otherwise, that says God is Panta as opposed to Tapon or either Pan or Holos, or something like God is the whole, God is the all, God is the everything. But Panta and Pasin, the only place that I know it occurs is in Anaxagoras, pre-Socratic. So it's not, and it's not in a Stoic sense, but
that just seemed like an odd turn of phrase to me.
It is indeed. It is indeed. Which is what makes that verse a puzzle. Like, what exactly does it mean to say that when the Son hands the kingdom over to the Father, then God is everything in everything? Where English translations, like the standard versions, usually say all in all, which is kind of poetic sounding, but they're both plurals.
Right.
So God may be all things in all things, which is it's a clunky phrase.
No, thank you, but I run to Villanova University. So I'm selfishly in mysticism now. Like, I'm just moving on. That's where my question is coming from. And thinking particular like origin, the Platonist, Platonist, and around this Exodus readiness, like the movement. So forget whether he's all or the substance of, but just the movement itself. I'd just like to hear you say more about how you conceive of Paul's understanding of this basic part of contemplation within mystical traditions. Because normally and the implication for that for me is that I don't like so much. It's really hard to separate Neoplatonism from mystical theology, Christian mysticism. And what you're doing is novel, like to be able to go back and say, well, maybe this made sense to them because it's biblical. It's already rooted within a Pauline understanding would be really helpful for me. And so I just wanted to hear you think out loud about the movement itself as opposed to the ontology or the metaphysics that is on.
Yeah.
Think out loud.
I'll give it my best try. It might be that I'm not familiar enough with the work you're doing for this to be relevant, in which case
The coming so the Exodus to leave the all in a descending type of way, and then the readiness through contemplation to ascend back into it all. And that's the journey of the mystical life. And playing this through one way, the souls through another. The movement is the same imagery. And it never even occurred to me that Paul was using the same type of movement.
Yeah, I suppose I'd say there's a homology there. Like, Paul's not here. I mean, in a different sense, I find lots of in a Jewish register like mysticism in Paul. Like he's really preoccupied with the vision of God, and of the transformation of the beholder into the divine likeness and so on. So that's a separate aspect, but I actually there's lots more sort of fodder for Paul fits in the history of mysticism, in the history of Jewish mysticism, and then as a kind of source for Christian mysticism far more than the study of Paul is, largely happened in kind of like Western, especially Protestant, but like ideas about forensic categories, and whereas actually I think a lot of his language is much more concerned with beholding God and transformation into sharing God's life and so on. That's one thing to say. But the Exodus Redditous business, the homology there is, that just is, I think, the pattern Paul uses when he talks about the origins of things and then the telos of things. I mean, beginning and end in Origin of Alexandria's terms, that God created, he's getting that in Greek from Greek Genesis, but also he uses this set of these prepositional phrases that for him, all that exists it moves out of God, it's moves through God, meaning I think God sustains. He doesn't say what the Stoics do, that God is sort of like pervading or present in everything, but he's the sustainer. And then everything goes not just English versions will often say from whom and through whom and for whom, as in like for whose glory or for whose benefit everything is. But that's not normally what asauton would mean. It's the pattern is motion out of, through, and into. But it's not just, for Paul at least, I think. That doesn't just mean, and this is the difference from the Stoics. I mean, the biggest difference is there's no recurrence. But another very big difference is it's not just sort of back to zero, because the telos for Paul, I think, is like it's a greater state of affairs than the primeval past was. So it's not just a return, because all all sentient things, maybe all of creation, share in the life of God in the end in a way that they didn't before. So it's a net gift of God to everything. I think that's what I'd say by way of answer.
So thank you.
Joseph Joseph, Georgetown, and Catholic Political Society. Have you seen anything in terms of a reference to influences from what was left of the Persian Empire on the eastern border of the Roman Empire, where with the thinking from the Gothams that in the end you have the ultimate triumph of good, and so in Zoroastrianism there is heaven, there is hell, there is resurrection of the dead. I'm convinced some of that in the air influenced at the time of the Babylonian captivity and came into Judaism. But in that thinking, in the end, that the ultimate triumph of good, hell is destroyed, and the humans that are in hell are resurrected and part in eternal life, and the evil spirits are annihilated. So if hell is eternal, and if evil spirits continue, then there's not the ultimate triumph of good, of God. And how much is that, not that there's a direct influence, but how much of that kind of thinking is still kind of crosses the border and begins to be part of the Stoicism and all the different things that quoted that are anathema than Paul.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks very much for that. It's a good point to which I don't have a very intelligent answer.
It's been studied enough.
No, I think you're right about that. I've read a couple of people who've made some connections like this, argued for a sort of cross permeation of Zoroastrian and sort of classical Greek ideas. So there may well be something there. I just don't know enough to.
Many years ago, I created the first course in Zoroastrianism at Georgetown. At that time, I think there were only 4 universities in the country that had an introductory course.
Yeah, thank you, Joe.
Going in a different direction. I'll use the sugar bowl for your Villanova. So you, at the beginning of your talk, you were speaking a little bit about that interesting 14th anathema and the disembodied minds. And you were saying that's another topic that we're not going to so much get into. I'm an early Christianity person. And I just thought that this was, I'm just curious if people know much about it. This is sort of a side talk, because I'm not really talking about author, we're talking about origin, if that's okay. Do you know if Justinian, what's going on here with the anathemas, has anybody talked about how this intersects with like Nagmati stuff? Because certainly this idea of like the Mufeoid, that's like the myth. You know, there's this focus on this myth, and also the naked minds. Who am I calling? It sounds very much like the noose entering the pleroma. And a lot of like Irenaeus, what he's talking about there, and it sounds. I mean, I'm also interested personally in how much the Gospel of Mary might have circulated, because there's a lot of talk about the Gospel of Mary and this sort of the noose coming to rest and kind of going past all these different levels of heaven. And I'm just curious. This is obviously a side track, but I just hadn't heard this 14th anathema, or I hadn't heard the Greek before, and I'm wondering if you know, have people done much there? With not just origin, but like, could this be responding to that?
It's a very good question. I know a bit, although not a great deal, enough to be helpful to you probably. It's a good suggestion. There's a good bit of secondary literature on the anathemas of 553 because, in particular because they are printed with, and not just printed, they were copied with in the Middle Ages they appear in manuscripts with the deliverances of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, the Second Council of Constantinople. And it's often talked about in the literature as if the anathemas were a deliverance of the council. And in that case, the ones of 543 are in a letter from Justinian. The anathemas of 553 in the manuscript tradition are attached to the proceedings of the council, which obviously lends them a weight if that's what they are. The interesting thing is, I think the current state of play is that they're thought not to actually be a deliverance of the council, but sort of attached to it. So that's one. There's a lot of literature on this, on sort of what the actual textual history of the anathemas and their relation to the deliverances of the council. The reason I attribute them, because this much I think we can say, they both come, first of all, from Justinian. They are, I mean, by definition, they're anti-heretical. They're often called anti-Origenist. They don't name Origen himself. And of course, in this context, they're more about Evagrius than about Origen. As far as I know, there's no mention of particular like apocryphal Christian texts as opposed to like named heretics and so on. But I mean, you're right, there's a lot of commonality of idea. And one of the things people have written, there's a lot of people have written about this in relation to Origen by way of often vindicating him, saying, well, these are called anti-Origenists, but he doesn't think 8 out of 10 of those things. So
I just, we were talking earlier about siloing. You were saying a lot of people either study the Jewish stuff or the classical stuff, and like maybe people aren't studying the Apocrypha or like the intertestament, like the Second Temple stuff, and then you just kind of miss stuff. And I just, a lot of times when I'm looking at this anti-Origin stuff, and it's like I was just looking at a manuscript at the Penn Museum that they have. It's a homily from Alexandria from probably the 5th or 6th century, and they're clearly anti-Originist. But then I found all these crossovers with the excerpts from Theodotus, which is 2nd century Valentinian stuff. And I'm like, whoa, I was like, wait, this person in Coptic is responding to Origen and Valentinian stuff. And I was just curious, I'm just curious if people like, is there the siloing whereby if there were something like that, people wouldn't notice because people are just focused on Origin and stuff that they've kind of skipped Agamadi, and then Agamadi are doing the other thing, so they're skipping the patristics, which they shouldn't. Do you think there's something there?
I suspect you're probably right about the sort of state of play in scholarship, and because I mean, you know better than I, but I think you're right that a lot of the themes and ideas might attach more naturally to some of what we think of as apocryphal Christian texts rather than, well, certainly rather than Origen, but even other, named philosophical theologians from antiquity. So I suspect there's a lot right about your suspicion.
Thank you for calling my attention to these anathemas. I need to.
Mark, one question. Terrific paper, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I don't know anything. Mark Smith from Theological Seminary. Thank you. You're very welcome. Gosh, anyway, so I wondered if you just had your own reflections on the matter with which you opened the paper, which is these anathemas that seem to be directed at Origen, and then a discussion about how Origen is or isn't hewing closely to Paul. It's like, So what do you think, what's the box score at the end about that whole debate? Or what, do you have any feelings about it after you've done this research?
Yeah, well, so this is all very much in progress. Like I haven't published on this topic at all, nor do I intend to soon. So there's a question, you may have noticed, there's a question mark at the end of the title of the paper, which is a sincere, not an ironic one. Like, so all very in process. But basically, I've come to think that Origen is actually quite Paulinist, or maybe Paul is very Origenist in lots of ways. Now, there's all kinds of ways in which they're not, but again, it has to do with the dominant interpretive traditions where, you know, if there's any, well, to go back to Father Chris's paper, like I mean, the ancient Christian thinker who's the towering interpreter of Paul is Augustine. Like Augustine is the Paul that most of us know is still largely Augustine's Paul. And that is overwhelmingly for the good in lots of ways. Like I think in a very different context and with lots of different concerns, or well, in just the ways I was asking about, like the Augustine-Pelagius controversy. Like if you read that bit of Ben Sira, but then you read Paul, well, then you have to come down on the Augustine side, it seems to me. So I'm not but it's precisely because I am so accustomed, and I think the whole discipline of New Testament studies, you know, is kind of accustomed to, even now that we criticize it, you still read Paul through the lens of Augustine. But I have just come to think that, oh, this is interesting. There's lots of little bits of Paul that didn't make really good sense to me until I would read Origen's exegesis, right? Like some of this language around the resurrection, I'm like, actually, that's pretty good. It's just it resolves a number of puzzles in the text that otherwise I didn't have a good answer for. Again, they part ways in lots of ways because Origen is far more he's far more of a philosopher than Paul is, but also he's far more of a Platonist in particular. So he has a theory of souls that is sort of far beyond anything Paul imagines. But basically, I think Origen gets quite a lot right in Paul, more than I had certainly appreciated before. And while you know, Paul literally doesn't speak of apokatastasis, but I think he does talk a lot about the end of everything. And his language is not as precise, but it has something to do with all people, certainly, and all things somehow sharing in the divine life in a way they should, you know, certainly don't now, and didn't even at the beginning. So yeah.
Thank you. That will do it. And we'll move on to the
All right, our next speaker is Paul Danove. He is the professor emeritus in New Testament from Villanova. He earned his PhD in 1991 from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. His STL in 1990 from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, and his MDiv in 1986 at the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley. Paul's research interests are in New Testament, narrative, rhetorical, and linguistic studies. His paper is titled Jesus' Procedure for Deducing What Is Not Permitted in the Gospel of Mark. So welcome, Paul. Thank you.
Please let me know if you can't hear me back there. This paper develops the Mark in Jesus' procedure for determining what is not permitted, existent. The introductory discussion establishes that within the Gospel of Mark, be permitted references actions that the statements of commandments in the scripture either require or prohibit. The discussion then specifies the procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit, implicit in the statements of John the Baptist, the Pharisees, sometimes with others, and Jesus. Examination of the remaining contexts referencing the commandments further clarifies Jesus' procedure. The discussion concludes with consideration of the manner in which disciples may apply Jesus' procedure in their own determination of what commandments do not permit. Part 1, existent, and the commandments. The identification of statements of the scriptural commandments as the basis permitting or not permitting specific actions is apparent in the 6 contexts containing existent. In 2:24, the Pharisees question, "Why are your disciples doing on the Sabbath what is not permitted?" appeals to commandments concerning the Sabbath observance. And Jesus' statement that David ate the breads of presentation, which no one is permitted to eat if not the priests, directly appeals to the commandment in Leviticus 24:9. In 3:4, Jesus' question, is it permitted to do on the Sabbath, good or evil, to save life or to kill, again appeals to commandments concerning Sabbath observance. In 6:18, John the Baptist is attributed with saying that it is not permitted for Herod to have the wife of his living brother, a direct appeal to Leviticus 18:16. Although the Pharisees' question in 10:2, is it permitted for a man to divorce his wife, presents a difficulty because there is no explicit scriptural commandment permitting or not permitting divorce. The use by both Jesus and the Pharisees of the phrase, what Moses commanded, which in the scriptures frequently references either the law and the commandments or commandments and ordinances or simply commandments, indicates that the commandments are still in view. In 12:14, the Pharisees and Herodians question, is it permitted to pay the census tax to Caesar, constitutes a direct appeal to those of the 10 commandments governing covenantal reverence for God over all others. So existent references statements of commandments. That's the takeaway. The procedure for determining what is not permitted. John the Baptist, the Pharisees, sometimes with others, and Jesus present differing procedures for determining what is not permitted. John the Baptist. The context of John's claim that Herodias is not permitted to have Herodias as a wife presents no information to indicate that John's procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit extends beyond applying the literal statement of a commandment, in this case, you shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. The Pharisees. The Pharisees, sometimes with others, exhibit a more nuanced procedure for determining what is not permitted. In 2:24, the Pharisees are aware of commandments prescribing work on the Sabbath, such as the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God, you shall not do any work on it, the Pharisees also may be expected to recognize potentially mitigating considerations, such as the statement permitting the plucking of grain from another's field. This indicates that the Pharisees' procedure prioritizes Sabbath commandments in situations of potentially conflicting obligations. Although there is no commandment explicitly licensing divorce, there are commandments discussing what is not permitted once a divorce has occurred. This indicates that the Pharisees' procedure grants the status of a commandment to that which other commandments assume to be permissible or not permissible. Based on their intent to trap Jesus, the Pharisees and Herodians apparently assume that commandments referencing obligations to God do not permit the paying of the census tax to Caesar. The Pharisees and Herodians also would recall, or I assume that they would recall, that God's negative response to David's numbering of the people for service to the kingdom. Thus, their procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit may draw on scriptural precedents to guide their interpretation and application of specific commandments. These considerations clarify that the procedure for determining what is not permitted by the Pharisees and others prioritizes Sabbath commandments, grants the status of a commandment to what is assumed by other commandments, and may reference scriptural precedents to guide their interpretation and application of specific commandments. Jesus's procedure. Jesus exhibits a two-step procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit. Although both stages receive development in the context of occurrences of ecstasy, the following discussion focuses on the first stage of Jesus's procedure. In 2:23 through 3:6, Jesus, in contrast to the Pharisees, apparently deems that the commandments permit his disciples to do what they are doing on the Sabbath. Jesus first appeals to the scriptural precedent in which David, who, when he was in need, ate the bread's presentation, which a commandment restricts to the priests. Since the scriptures record Daniel's action without condemnation, David's violation of this commandment may serve, may not, but may serve as a scriptural precedent for the Pharisees, who may accept such considerations in their deliberations. The parallels between David's and the disciples' action engendered by the repetition of do poieo also proposes that the disciples, like David, act out of need. Jesus then clarifies the first stage of the procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit by appealing to God's intent in creating human beings by saying, the Sabbath came to be because of the human being and not the human being because of the Sabbath. The resulting primacy of the human being over even the Sabbath then joins with the precedent of David's action to provide a scriptural warrant for addressing the disciples' need even on the Sabbath. Jesus then explicitly universalizes the consideration of human need to encompass any action that does good and saves life on the Sabbath in the remainder of that passage. In 10:2 through 9, Jesus determines that the commandments, or at least what the commandments assume about divorce, do not permit a man to divorce his wife. Jesus again appeals to God's intent in creating human beings. God created them male and female, and because of this, a man will leave behind his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That is, the two becoming one flesh is a direct consequence of God's intent in creating, and as such, cannot be undone by human action. The apparent basis of Jesus's conclusion is the assumption that God's actions cannot be in conflict. That is, God cannot both cause the formation of an unbreakable union and at the same time author commandments that assume that this union can be broken. As a consequence, the commandments that the Pharisees use to legitimize divorce must be of human origin and in fact are attributable to human hardness of heart. In 12:13 through 17, Jesus's consistent appeal to God's intent in creating in the previous context as the first stage in determining what is not permitted engenders an expectation for a similar appeal in this context. This expectation highlights the word image, akon, in Jesus's responding question about whose image and inscription appears on the coin. Image recalls God's intent to make human beings in God's image and subsequent action of doing so. Greek grammar, like English grammar, imposes the interpretation that the one making something has possession of what is made unless the context explicitly specifies otherwise. Since the scriptural context concerning God's intent and action in making human beings present no such countervailing consideration, God is attributed with possession of human beings who bear God's image. Parallel reasoning then dictates that Caesar has possession of the coins bearing his image and minted at his command. At this point, Jesus's use of pay back, apodinomy, situates Jesus's response in an appeal to the commandments concerning the paying back of what is owed to another. Thus, Jesus's final response indicates that the commandments permit human beings to pay back themselves to God and the census tax to Caesar. These considerations indicate that the first stage in Jesus's procedure for determining what commandments do not permit is to establish that they reflect God's intent in creating human beings and so have God as their author. The second stage, although not yet fully formulated, is to establish that enactment of the commandments addresses human need, does good, saves life, and pays back what is owed to God and others. Step 2 of Jesus's procedure. Jesus discusses commandments in 3 contexts outside, not containing existence, citing statements from the 10 Commandments, the Great Commandment, and the Holiness Code, and a paraphrase of the commandment prohibiting defrauding. Jesus's positive use of these commandments indicates that they reflect God's intent in creating human beings. The 3 contexts clarify the second stage of Jesus' procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit. In 7:5 through 13, Jesus responds to a question of the Pharisees and scribes, because of which thing do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders? Jesus' discussion of the gift then demonstrates that the tradition of the elders are human commands that nullify the word of God in the commandments about honoring one's father and mother. In so doing, Jesus rejects the tradition of the elders as an appropriate guide for deciding what the commandments do not permit, and proposes instead as a guide that which fulfills the first of the 10 commandments that governs relationships among human beings. In 10:17 through 22, Jesus responds to a man's question, "What may I do so that I may inherit everlasting life?" by citing statements from the 10 Commandments and the Holiness Code and the paraphrase from the commandment against withholding wages, all of which concern proper relationships among human beings. The man's response that he he kept these commandments from his youth elicits Jesus's further response that merely keeping the statements of the commandments is a necessary but not a sufficient enactment of what they demand. Rather, these commandments are to be enacted in a manner that actively benefits the poor. Go sell what you have and give it to the poor, and strengthens one's relationship with Jesus. Come, follow me. In 12:29 through 31, Jesus responds to a scribe's question concerning the greatest commandment by citing and prioritizing the love of God and the love of neighbor above all other commandments. Jesus' ordering of the commandments clarifies the second part of his procedure for determining what the commandments permit. All commandments reflecting God's intent in creating human beings permit positive action that accomplishes the love of God and the love of neighbor, or prohibit actions that violate the love of God and the love of neighbor. Accomplishing what such commandments permit and avoiding what they prohibit honors God's intent in creating, and so fulfills the commandments to love God and to love neighbor. Jesus' further response that the scribe accepting, his prioritization of commandments is not far from the reign of God, however, contains a warning within the Gospel of Mark. Only entering God's reign is associated with inheriting everlasting life. Thus, although accepting Jesus' teaching about the commandments brings proximity to God's reign, only enacting the teaching, his teaching, accomplishes entrance into it, and so inheritance of life. These considerations indicate that the second stage of Jesus's procedure for determining what commandments do not permit is enactment of the commandments that reflect God's creative intent in a manner that actively accomplishes the love of God and the love of neighbor. And finally, part 4, the disciples' application of Jesus's procedure. These considerations leave pending the manner in which disciples of Jesus are to apply his procedure for determining what the commandments do not permit. Within Mark, only Jesus is attributed with reliable knowledge of God's intent in creating human beings, and the portrayal of the Pharisees, other authorities that comment on the commandments, and the frequently hapless disciples proposes that the first stage of Jesus's procedure belongs uniquely to Jesus. That is, disciples will need to enact the commandments explicitly accepted by Jesus in the manner proposed by Jesus. Use of the second stage of Jesus's procedure, however, is possible even for occasionally hapless disciples who take Jesus's teaching and actions as a guide. Disciples will need to determine whether the commandments do or do not permit action that addresses human need, does good, saves life, benefits the poor, strengthens one's relationship with Jesus, pays back to God what belongs to God, and to others what belongs to them, and in so doing, accomplishes the love of God and the love of neighbor. Thank you.
All right, questions?
Yes?
I'm just curious, is this,
Could you introduce
oh,
yourself?
sorry.
Thank you so much.
Gunter, Villanova University. Has this sort of two-step procedure been articulated elsewhere, or is this your sort of formulated? I know you spent a lot of your career on Mark's Gospel.
The first stage has been discussed rather extensively. the frequent appeal to. The second stage has been addressed, but not in the same context so much as in other deliberations on how to apply the commandments. And to my knowledge, nobody has ever said, so what do we do with this as disciples of Jesus? So I guess you could say that 90% of the paper has already been done elsewhere, but I have not seen clearly articulated how a cone image plays into the whole, although it's been mentioned in passing, and I haven't seen anybody put together quite the way I have.
Mark Smith from Princeton Theological Seminary.
Nice to meet you.
Pleasure it is to you. Now that we've reversed roles, I'm going to ask like a stupid question to someone who doesn't really understand the New Testament. Going back to Mark 12, Jesus saw that he answered wisely. He said to him, etc., and you are not far from the kingdom of God. I kind of missed something on the punchline there. That is, what is this person failing to do such that they're not far, but they're not in?
Well, they acknowledge the truth of Jesus's teaching.
Yeah.
But entering the reign of God or entering into life requires the type of active application of the commandments, going back to chapter 10. I did all of these commandments, but that's not enough. They're necessary. Doing the commandments is necessary, but it's not sufficient.
And you see that in verse 34. You get that out of verse 34?
I do, and this is how I get it out of. First of all, you have to realize that the original question is.
Could you stand in front of this microphone? Thank you.
You have to realize that the original question is adversarial. This is the series of attacks against Jesus.
Yeah.
And so Jesus is coming back and saying, well, a good answer, but.
It's true. It does end, it says, and after that, no one dared to ask you any questions. So I take your surmise. I just felt like this guy did pretty well, actually. I thought was the answer.
Well, he did, and he's not far from the reign of God, which is great. It's just the truth. You're not stepping into it unless, and that sets it in parallel with the previous three interrogations of Jesus, which at the end there's a critique of the opponents built into them, and here the critique is, well, you're not far from the reign of God. You know, you almost passed.
Yeah, it sounds like a roast or something.
Yeah.
Peter from Villanova University.
Nice to meet you.
So, nice to meet you. Is it not that basically everybody in the Gospel of Mark is not far from the kingdom of God? There's, with the exception of, I think, the children in 10:16 who enter the house in which Jesus resides. Those are the only ones of them. So they're actually in the place where Jesus is. Everybody else is sort of not quite yet there. Even the
correct. Yeah. Even the good guys are not there yet, and no one is there yet except Jesus.
So could one not, phrase this positive to say, hey, this good Pharisee is just a paradigm of deception. You're there, it's just not quite yet.
I wouldn't, because he starts with a tricky question, which usually the disciples start with, in Mark's gospel, somewhat dumb questions, as opposed to tricky. But I think that there's an acknowledgement of, for the first time, by this scribe, that Jesus answered well. The other people were left dangling. They get angry. They seek to arrest, or they want to arrest him. I think that the scribe would go back to chapter 4. It's sort of like the seeds that fall on the ground, where they start off with joy and then they don't peter out at the they don't last until the end. So I think there's still a critique here that is different from the critique that is applied to disciples. But in general, everybody, and I would even say, I would box the children coming to Jesus as an aside. Everybody else is short of the mark except for Jesus. Yes. Thanks.
And what's your name?
Joseph Jensen, Georgetown University in Mathematics. Would you say that, in a sense, the question was, what must I do? The distinction is there's a difference between knowing the right answer and living it. And so everyone knows the right answer, so you're close, but it's not, knowing the right answer isn't sufficient. It's the enactment.
Right, and filling the baseline expectation of the statement of the commandment is not adequate from Jesus's point of view. There has to be more that involves a personal commitment and relationship. That
Living it.
Yeah.
What else?
I really thought there were two things people would come after me on,
Tell us. Tell us, Rabbi.
First of all, it's not universally accepted that the disciples are acting out of need, although that's the majority position. But I think that the repetition of poieo solves the problem for me. The second is that not everybody would say that the word akon in the question of is it permissible to pay census tax would evoke the creation account. But there's a very interesting article that came out recently pointing out that not only the image of God is on human beings, but according to Pentateuchal requirements, we're supposed to have the word of God on our minds, which would be on us. So the inscription of God would also be on us. But I guess that was too persuasive.
I'll ask you a question.
Yes, sir.
I'm Archie Wright. Yeah. So does this guy ever get into the kingdom?
If you've read the end of the Gospel of Mark, I don't know if anybody but Jesus gets into the kingdom. So, there's a hope. There's hope. And I don't want to open up a whole new avenue of disagreement here, but I think that Mark, when he says the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, which is where we get the idea or people start talking about the genre of gospel, is because I think that Mark is saying these 16 chapters are the beginning of a proclamation of Jesus Christ, Son of God. That's just the beginning. And it's before all of the rest of the stuff happens. That's the rest of the proclamation of Jesus Christ, Son of God. So I'm not concerned that nobody actually gets to enter life or the reign of God within the gospel text itself, because I really think of the whole Gospel of Mark as the beginning of a long story. And this is the first chapter, the important chapter. But we're living out the rest of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God now.
That might kind of go back to what Peter was saying about everybody seems to not quite be there.
Right, and that's okay, because the one thing that we're all lacking in the Gospel of Mark is the Spirit of the Holy Spirit, which is bottled up in Jesus, only comes out at his resurrection, and then we have the quick ending. There's no time for us to see what happens when that Spirit gets out there and when people finally do get to see Jesus. We don't know, it's open. It's our story, not Mark's story.
No, does Mark have the sense of, it shows up in another gospel, of what you mean do? That entry into the kingdom is a gift, and there's nothing you can do. Is any of that? Is that?
No, I don't get that out of Mark. I don't get that out of the Gospels at all, in fact, because Matthew, whatever you did, that's the judgment scene. Whatever you did for the least of my brothers and sisters, this you did for me. Jesus says, you keep the commandment, you sell what you have, it's all doing. There's no explicit reference to the word faith in judgment scenes. It's always what you did. Now you do it based in your faith. I mean, that's what that's the motivation. That's the completion of your faith. But did you go to the next step and do it is the last question.
That there isn't a sense of, wait a second, in the end, it's just, going where Luther was, that you can't do anything. That's not part of it.
I don't see that anywhere in the gospel.
Okay, yeah, that's what.
Yeah. Actually, I don't see it anywhere else either.
Jesus asked them if they, didn't you do this, and didn't you do this, didn't you do this, that they didn't?
Yeah, it doesn't say, did you recite the right creed or did you, none of that. It's whatever you did to the least of my brothers that you did for me, come on in.
All right.
And then everywhere, it's even remaining with Jesus is an action in John's gospel. You have to remember what he said, you have to put it into effect, and you have to love one another. It's not about some propositional statement somewhere.
Hi, Paul, it's Peter again from Villanova. Pondering this conversation, especially when you said kind of the abrupt ending of Mark. Could it be that if we look at the secondary and tertiary endings of Mark, could we not read these sort of as an early kind of filling in the blanks that precisely provides that narrative? Because if I look at the end, verses 17 and 18, those who are being sent out will actually be known to do exactly what Jesus did.
That's right.
And therefore, as the ultimate insiders. And so that move, you're not far from the kingdom, seems to be closed, right, with that gap.
Yeah, I mean, the absence of closure at the end of Mark's gospel leaves everybody in a lurch. And the impetus is to solve the problem narratively by adding some kind of an ending onto the story. But I think that doesn't do justice to the narrative technique we find in the scriptures. The Hebrew Bible, or I always read the Septuagint for my work. The ending of the book of Jonah doesn't resolve anything because he's sitting under the tree and it withers and he's upset. And we're supposed to be left in a lurch because the responsibility for finishing the gospel or finishing the book of Jonah isn't the author's problem, it's ours.
Going back to the conversation about that good Pharisee, could it be that the thing that's missing in the Pharisee's response, but also in virtually everybody else, is that which is actually formulated at the very end of kind of the mark as we have it printed in our texts.
With the longer ending?
Yeah, and that is, I find it interesting. There is no mentioning there, you have to have faith in me or faith in God. It's actually, you have to do what I do. So it's actually through this agency that relives, the agency of Jesus. One seems to close the gap. And I mean, that would make sense then, right? The Pharisee isn't there. because he doesn't do what Jesus does. Well, and the disciples are struggling anyway
Yeah, they're all.
to get there, but perhaps, kind of in an old Pelagian way, right? Do what Jesus did.
Yeah, but like I said, the disciples never are portrayed after Jesus lets out the Spirit at his death. So we don't get to see the effect of Jesus baptizing with the Holy Spirit, which John the Baptist predicted at the beginning. We don't get to see inside of the story bequeathed to us, which I think ends at 16:8. We don't get to see that happen. We get to live it. And that's the value of I think Mark's ending, is that it leaves us like the book of Jonah, where if how do we react to that? Do we sympathize with Jonah? Man, God really let off these bad guys, and look at us, or do we celebrate that more people have turned to God? I think that the open-endedness of it, with good scriptural precedent, is a teaching tool that Mark's story uses very well. Now, the rest of the other two synoptic gospels really do polish it off and give us a dynamite ending that, in a sense, removes the urgency from me to do something about the ending. So,
Yeah. Thanks.
Okay.
Chris Mark, St. Charles Borromeo Seminary.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much for your paper and for this presentation. Could you just comment and expand on how James 2 relates to some of what you've already been talking about here? I thought you were going to mention it. I didn't hear it, and I would be interested to know.
We're talking about the letter of James. Well, I mean, I didn't mention it because when I write about Mark and what came before. So in the scriptures, I don't deal with other New Testament writers. I think I used to use James chapter 2 on the second to last day of my introduction to the New Testament course to say, did James get it, even though I don't know if it was written before or after the Gospels? Did they get the point about judgment? And the students they didn't know what to say because they didn't want to get it wrong. But I'd tease it out of them, and yeah, James got it right. Faith is of absolute value when you put it into action. Prior to that, he says it's dead. I'd say it's useless. Believing the right thing and not acting out of that belief is a type of, I used to call it a spiritual disorder. Because if you don't act from what you believe, your actions tell you what you really believe. And so I used to use, because I spent most of Gospels take up a lot of room. I spent most of the introduction to the New Testament on the Gospels, and then we read the other parts in pieces. But that seems to be the bottom line. Did you do something with what you knew God was calling you to do? Yes or no?
All right, last question.
It's not a question, or maybe it is a question, that prior to Mark, these are simultaneous, that you have Paul in Galatians. The only thing that counts is faith working through love.
Right. I mean, it's there. It's just that when I write about Mark, I don't write about what's going on. I'm looking usually inside, because I'm narratologist, and previous, which means the scriptures. But it's there. It's there. Yeah, love one another is our love for your neighbor.
The only thing that counts is faith working through love.
Through love. Yeah, I always used to tell my students that I do semantic analysis in my articles, and I can't analyze the verb agapao because it's an experiential verb. Love, you experience something in Greek, but in the New Testament, it's an action verb. It's doing good for another. Now you do that out of an emotional response to the person, a positive response, but if it doesn't complete itself in doing, it's not love. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Okay. Come on up, Kim. You're invisible. All right. Okay, thank you. Want to welcome our next speaker. Kim Gunter is a PhD candidate here at Villanova University. Her interests are in Bible and ethics. And throw some New Testament and Gospels in there, I think. Her paper today is titled Demons, Dogs, and a Daughter: How a Slave Woman Defied the Rules to Corner Jesus into Healing Her Child. Sounds like a little manipulation there, but I don't know. So welcome, Kim.
Thank you.
Forward to hear you.
This is my first CBA as well, and my first, it's also my first conference, so please be kind. That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and see most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman? You may know these words. They are not my own. They are from a speech delivered at the 1851 Women's Convention in Akron, Ohio, by formerly enslaved African-American abolitionist Sojourner Truth. It is documented that Truth was born Isabella Baumfree, but she changed her name to Sojourner Truth after her conversion to Christianity, saying that she took the name Sojourner because I was to travel up and down the land showing people their sins and being assigned to them. And Truth because I was to declare the truth unto the people. Declaring the truth unto the people is more than a noble sojourn. It is the foundation of Christianity as it is the basis of the incarnation of Jesus. And often that truth travels via signs through people and challenging language. The synoptic gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, describe Jesus's ministry sojourn throughout the region of Israel and surrounding areas. But there is a peculiar story, particular in Matthew 15:21-28 and Mark 7:24-36, when Jesus purposefully went into Galilee, the Gentile region of Tyre and Sidon, to encounter a person who would be both a sign and a messenger of truth. This paper sojourns to this Gentile region and tarries in the encounter. First, to uncover the significant identifying details of the Matthew and Markan stories. The two synoptic writers shared this story of Jesus' healing power and systematically identify the miracle requester, not by name, but by people, ethnicity, gender, status, class, behavior, and words that are decidedly not of Israelite origin and not Jewish. Second, this paper explores the significance of this woman's faith against the odds. As Jesus acts in demission of her, ignoring her request to exorcise the demon tormenting her daughter, he hurls a strange and offensive diversionary riddle at her about throwing food to dogs. Undeterred in her purpose, she witfully solves the riddle, redirecting the miracle worker back to her request, thereby placing Jesus in a precarious position. Finally, this paper challenges our collective imagination by asking, must all marginalized women possess a faith that outwits and contorts just to be heard, taken seriously, and afforded the power of a miracle? Canaanite or Greek Syrophoenician, but decidedly not Judean or Jewish. The encounter with this woman appears after Jesus spars with his own people in his own land. They fight over their traditions, with Jesus hurling insults, labeling the Pharisees hypocrites and his own disciples as incessantly lacking understanding. Several times in both the Matthew and Markan accounts, Jesus proclaims that defilement is not based on what is on the outside of a person, but on what comes out of a person's mouth or from within, from the heart, which is the seat of things like evil intentions, false witness, and slander. Presumably, with these remedial confrontations on his mind and in the way of biblical movement, Jesus first encounters this woman in the Gospel of Matthew 15, 21 to 28. Jesus leaves Israel to travel to the district of Tyre and Sidon, knowingly entering into a region of people who were well-known enemies of the Jews. The hostility present in this story would have been palpable to the people of Matthew's day, who were still reeling from the residue of the Judean War, 66 to 70 CE, when Tyrians killed and imprisoned Judeans. It is here that Matthew's gospel, in redacting Mark's rendering, inserts details that amplify and supercharge the identity of this miracle requester as a Canaanite woman. Jesus is approached by a loud, shouting Canaanite woman. She is markedly Gentile. Daniel and Gulata claims that throughout the Gospel of Matthew, derogatory language is consistently used to describe Gentiles. But this woman is not just Gentile. She is intentionally and deliberately identified as Canaanite, an identity that evokes an ancient fear in her otherness, with a hatred of the foreigner, the unknown one, the one that became the enemy of Abraham. Stephen D. Moore notes this identifier as an epithet more redolent of ethnic violence. Reaching back into the text of Genesis 9, Moore reminds that Canaan is styled a slave from the outset in the primeval history, and to be both Canaanite and female subjected her to the hegemonic whims and whimsy of elite free males. Thus, the woman in Matthew 15 is gendered, ethnic, socially unrefined, and inferior to all she will encounter. Through Mark's gospel, which is presumed to precede and serve as a source for Matthew's gospel, Mark's gospel offers fewer identifiers for this woman, the second gospel similarly places this woman's story after Jesus' encounters with the Pharisees and his teaching and remedial training to his disciples on defilement. She is again introduced by naming her people and ethnicity without naming her. However, her sojourn into an encounter with Jesus is less public than the Matthean encounter. While Matthew's encounter infers a countryside or citywide open street air ambush that occurs as soon as Jesus enters the region, in contrast, the Markan scene places the encounter inside a house to which Jesus goes to retreat, where this woman is an intruder. Though the settings may differ, her foreignness is equally dispositive, as the Markan text clearly identifies her as a Gentile, a Greek of the southern region of Syria. The Gospel of Mark, like Matthew, who follows his missive, introduces this woman, names her people and her ethnicity, again, without naming her. By focusing on her Greek and Syrophoenician identity, Mitzi J. Smith notes that she and her people are distinguished from the Jewish people, but more precisely, the woman is racially a Syrophoenician. She is possibly mixed race. In the 1st century BCE or CE, the terms Greek and Syrian could be used to describe intersecting civil categories, not mutually exclusive ethnic ones. The scene is set. This foreign, loud, intrusive, aggressive, slave, mixed race, Canaanite, Greek, Gentile, Syrophoenician woman of Tyre and Sidon versus Jesus, the disciples, and the Jews. 3 against 1. The outcome seems sure. Faith against the odds. While Mark identifies this woman as a singular intruder upon Jesus's coastal retreat, Matthew identifies her as abrasive, loud, and aggressive. Where Jesus withdrew to Tyre and Sidon, the Canaanite woman came out, suggesting that her movement is hostile, a physical approach. However, in recognizing the dichotomy and the not so subtle distinctions presented in the Matthean account, C.L. Nash advises that this Canaanite woman, who Nash calls a historic Black woman, purposefully approaches Jesus, recognizing that the work of dismantling hegemonic social structures requires the persistence of journeying and crossing perceived acceptable boundaries. Nash highlights the courage this woman displays to stand among these Jewish men to seek mercy and healing for her daughter. At the same time, Jesus is not off the hook. Nash further observes that Jesus' withdrawal into this region portrays his trespass into this woman's territory, or neighborhood, if you will, thereby imposing an unintentional level setting in the encounter scene. But Smith reminds us of the nature of oppression, stating that this place, Tyre, should be neutral and friendly territory for her. It is either her home or close to it. But oppressions like sexism, racism, and classism transcend place and transgress borders because defiled, fallible human beings are carriers of oppression, and Jesus is no exception. It is from this position that the woman cries out, referring to Jesus as Lord, Son of David, recognizing Jesus's messianic title. Moore suggests that using the Jewish title, she debases herself as having been confronted with such a paragon of masculinity, the only appropriate response from a social or ethnic inferior fawning obeisance, ignoring her own polytheistic faith to worship Jesus. But she does not display internalized inferiority or someone who has given up or given in to such social pressure. Even when Jesus ignores her request for mercy and healing for her daughter, she continues to defy the confounds of the identity imposed upon her. When the disciples tell Jesus to send her away, Jesus answers them by repeating the instruction he delivered to them in Matthew 10, when he gave them authority over unclean spirits. There, Jesus told the disciples, "Go nowhere among the Gentiles, but rather go to the lost sheep of Israel." Yet here is Jesus, having led the disciples into the Gentile territory, hypocritically repeating the charge that has lost its power while simultaneously ignoring a plea to exercise his authority over an unclean spirit. The irony is palpable. This mother is standing in faith against the odds. Jesus in the corner of no return. Moore sees it otherwise, claiming that as a Canaanite woman, she is not a lost sheep of Israel, but a dog woman, a slave. Moore may miss the irony and the way in which this woman witfully setting Jesus up for her blessing. She is the sign. She, like Sojourner Truth, has seen Jesus. She has heard of his demon healing power. She is resistant to the sting of being ignored, to not ever being helped into carriages or over mud puddles or given any best place. She is immune from the fact that she appears to be, she is immune from the fact that she who appears to be more is more important than who she needs, what she needs. So she persists. She does not go away. She asks Jesus for help and to cast the demon out of her daughter. She bows down at Jesus' feet and defies the stereotype that Jesus attempts to perpetrate by riddling her about throwing the children's food to dogs. Wongi Park notes the monumental sacrifice of her purposeful act of bowing, which I call taking a knee, before Jesus, stating this woman is the only non-Judean to prostrate herself before the Judean Jesus. Though Park sees this as demeaning, it is anything but. It is the sharp, protective, inventive, quick, keen, responsive, pure act of a disenfranchised mother to put her own body on the line to save the life of her child. She bows as a kind of surrender that is until Jesus utters his riddle. What Jesus and many readers fail to remember is that he is no longer in Israel. She is not Jewish. She is not a dull Pharisee holding on to stale traditions. She is not a member of his brood of disciples incessantly lacking understanding. She does not need to ask him to explain the parable to us. She is a woman who has cried out with her mother's grief, and now she is taking a stance to ensure that no one hears her, that if no one hears her, Jesus will hear her. C.L. Nash makes this clear by noting that when Jesus tells the Syrophoenician woman that it isn't beneficial to give the dogs the food of the children of Israel, she boldly identifies why she is not one of the dogs by saying, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from the master's table." The woman is challenging his lack of help by stating that even dogs would receive crumbs, yet by refusing to give her anything at all, he proves that she is not a dog because dogs receive something. Despite assumptions seeking to diminish her dignity, the woman persists. Jesus has taken great lengths to explain to the Jewish crowds and the disciples that it is not what comes into a person from the outside of them that defiles them. Mark 7:18, 20 through 23 details Jesus' teaching. Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from the outside cannot defile? And he said, it is what comes out of a person that defiles. For it is from within, from the human heart, that evil intentions come. Fornication, theft, murder, adultery, avarice, wickedness, deceit, licentiousness, I'm not going to say it, licentiousness, y'all know what I mean. Envy, slander, pride, folly, all these evil things come from within, and they defile a person. By his own teaching, then, Jesus makes clear that his silence, demission, and riddles cannot defile, debase, or degrade her. Even when she and her daughter, like countless women of color, Black women in particular, were not viewed on equal footing with others and deserving of a healing, even though Jesus had already exorcised demons, healed a Gentile sick servant, and healed a little girl, like Sojourner Truth, this Canaanite Syrophoenician woman maintains her dignity as a woman. She remains strategic, wise, and intelligent as she answers him with confidence. Mitzi J. Smith explains this further, saying, the woman, in her response to Jesus, says yes, but no. She plays it smart by pretending she was accepting Jesus's argument and used it to her own advantage and by not behaving as if Jesus insulted her. The Syrophoenician woman did not let the differences in their ethnicity or status, Jesus's reputation as a healer, or any stigma associated with her having a daughter possessed by an unclean spirit hinder her from sassing and talking back to Jesus. She questioned Jesus and the authoritative tradition he quoted that could have stopped her in her tracks and denied her daughter the healing she sought and needed, and which he has so freely bestowed upon others. Clearly, all lives do not matter equally. Jesus had no right to treat her as less than a dog in her hour of motherly desperation. The Syrophoenician woman went toe to toe with Jesus. The woman uses his own argument. And by her persistence, the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman backs Jesus into a corner. He has a decision to make. Does he let this foreign woman outwit him? Does he remain callous and unchristlike? Does he humbly acquiesce to her request? Or does he reassert his authority by showing forth his power by performing an unfathomable miracle? Jesus does the latter. Just as he healed the Gentile centurion's servant via long-distance healing, Jesus once again announces this Gentile woman's great faith heals her daughter from the demon. It should be noted that this encounter that unfolds on the margins of Israel in the coastal vicinity of Tyre and Sidon, is conspicuously absent from Luke's gospel, despite Luke's purported praise of women, which markedly is Jewish women, and an overwhelmingly positive attitude towards Gentiles, which is mostly Gentile men or women connected to prominent Gentile men. Perhaps Luke omits the story for obvious reasons, because the story tells of an unflattering encounter in which Jesus displays sexism, stereotyping, oppression, rejection, demission, preferentialism, ethnicism, and name-calling to a multi-oppressed Gentile woman. If, however, we accept Mark Goodacre's assertion that Matthew's gospel was a direct catalyst for Luke's own reworking of Mark, and not only a catalyst, but also a source, providing Luke with much material, maybe Luke could not rework the story in any way that would shed a welcoming light on Jesus, such as to overcome the derogatory and ethnically charged language consistent in both Matthew and Mark. Or perhaps Luke could not rework this story because this woman, this ethnically marginalized woman, so bested Jesus in a strategic display of wit that further attention to the encounter might serve as an inspiring sign of truth that could ignite women across the centuries. Conclusion. In 1983, Alice Walker defined womanist. In the first part of the definition, Walker defines womanist as a Black feminist, a feminist of color, usually referring to outrageous, audacious, courageous, and willful behavior, responsible, in charge, serious. This definition describes the Canaanite Syrophoenician woman of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. She is a mother, fiercely committed to the healing of her daughter, despite labels, attitudes, and words. This woman displays mother wit, a quality that is not to be confused with a mother's wit, because a mother's wit would require an auntie's wit, a cousin's wit, a sister's wit, and so forth. Instead, mother wit encompasses them all, giving homage to the ancestral fortitude and determination of foremothers like Sojourner Truth, who passed this form of wit to generations after her, leading by example. In asking, "Ain't I a woman?" Sojourner Truth conveys the centuries-old question asked by marginalized women, sadly, including women of great faith. We should not ignore or remain unmoved by the experiences of women who shout, cry, beg, exist, and live on the margins, in the regions on the borders of life and death. Instead, we must listen and respond with a faith that seeks not merely understanding, but action, change, and justice. This paper ultimately asks, Should Jesus, living through contemporary Christians, stigmatize or serve? Must we continue to allow the outer identity of women on the margins mask what is innately wise, understanding, worthy, and undefiled deep within her heart? I think we know the answer.
Right. Dennis?
John Howard University. Thank you for exceptional paper. I love the way that you use intersectionality and bonus. Couple of questions. It's a two-pronged question. First, the question about geography, and there's other places where Jesus is moving and he's quite upset and he curses out and Corazon, and if you look at, let's say, that his hometown of Peter, Andrew, and probably Philip as well too. And then there's even a place where if you all have repented, it would be better for like you to say yourself, I'm sure you can run past as well. So there's some sort of a deliberate intentionality of crossing into someone else's territory. And you can comment on that. He does that for a scenario as well too, John 4, right? And so there seems to be an intentional sort of crossing into that boundary. So that's my first question about boundary. And yeah, again, even if again, going from Nazareth to Capernaum and whatnot, that whole entire upper northern Galilee area is fluid, and it's just an important trade route. I'm not sure if currently New Testament readers are reading, but Capernaum was an important sort of a trade route for the Silk Road as well too. Okay, having said that, my second question is a little bit more in sort of like with the woman at large. And I hear what you're saying. This is what we do in Howard as well too. And so when we study women's studies, the problem that we have in critical positions, okay, so you're going to cite Alice Walker, which is fantastic. Where's the methodology behind it? How do we critique it? That's the one thing. No human being sitting in here is going to critique Alice Walker. Okay? You can't. Are you going to critique Alice Walker? No. You're not. We can't critique. We just have to accept. So again, methodology is about critiquing. So this is where I engage my students. Okay, so like, how would this reading be different if it came from Black feminism like Patricia Hill Collins, where she does base a theory of consciousness and quote unquote German critical theory as a Black woman. Okay, so my question here is, how would your reading be different if it is coming from a Black feminist versus a womanist reading?
Okay.
And how would that impact the Syrophoenician woman?
Okay. Did I say this was my first conference? Okay. That was a joke. I'm sorry. So in terms of intentionality and crossing over, I think that the way that I have been taught about it, and that's basically from church and not in seminary and here, and I will get into that, is that Jesus just loves everybody. Jesus loves all the little children, right? And so Jesus is doing that to show that he intends to reach everybody. But I think when we dig deeper into it, I think it is that in some way Jesus is saying to the disciples, because Peter will, although he fights with Paul, Peter will in some way have that dream and then realize that he does need to reach out to Gentiles and he does need to open this up to Gentiles. So I think that Jesus does that in a way and is offensive to call out the racism, sex, maybe not racism, ethnicism of the time, and that he is as much affected by it as a human being as the rest of them are. So that's what I think about that, if I answered your question. In terms of methodology, I do think that womanism is a methodology, and I hear what you're saying. because the lived experiences of Black women and bringing that into the critique of scripture and the interpretation of scripture is a methodology.
I agree with that. Thing where you said, right? But why stop where what you just said? You corrected yourself. In other words, like, well, maybe it's not racism.
Well,
okay, let me push you that.
Mhm.
I know what I have to say. I know. I know you're Jordy here. Why stop? Why not simply say Jesus is the racist? What prevents you from saying that? Why? Why are you stopping there? Why are you protecting Jesus?
I didn't think I was. I didn't think I was. Maybe that's the Baptist in me coming out, but I didn't think I was. And quite frankly, I am willing to go further. I think Jesus is highly racist in this, and I think she bests him on that.
That's what I wanted to hear.
Okay, he is.
I think it's pretty fantastic for her paper personally. Oh, sorry, Elizabeth Shiner, Pulitzer, Villanova University. I just love that you gave this paper here because there's been a lot of rich types of discussions at this conference, and this is one that would be really neat. So thank you for bringing this in here. I have lots of questions about this. I guess my first question is, I see that you're making the choice to sort of collapse Matthew's and Mark's story into one. And I'm wondering if that's deliberate, if there's a reason that you're doing that, or if it would be preferable to choose. I think Mitzi Smith chooses. Does she choose the Syrophoenician woman?
She chose Mark.
Yeah. And some people like choosing Mark because they're like, that's the more historical version, and Matthew has changed it for whatever theological reason. But I think that the real key there is whether Jesus is sort of like whether he goes to her or whether she comes to him.
Right.
And that's the difference between Matthew and Mark.
Right.
And I'm wondering if you can collapse them, considering that there's that difference between the two of them. And I'm wondering if it would work better to choose one over the other, or whether you're deliberately, I mean, if you're trying to address them simultaneously, it just makes it a little complicated. And I'm wondering if you want that complication or if it were better to choose one.
Do you mind? No, I don't. Two of my professors right here, so am I going to tell them no?
You want to answer that?
Well, I think there's a little bit behind why I did that, and I think you know the answer to why I did that. But I think that to really get a good understanding of what this story, they need to be told together, and the fact that Luke didn't tell it. I think that for a view of the synoptic gospels I'm sorry, what you say?
Synoptics, that's synoptics.
I think that they should be told, and yes, it is difficult, and I mean, I would have made much more time to go into really delve into them kind of in parallel, and maybe even better.
All right. Yeah, so I'm just saying this, whatever the choice is, just be conscious of it. And maybe articulate it clearly.
Okay.
Like I'm choosing to do both simultaneously.
Okay.
X, Y, Z. And I'm also, as far as bringing in good acre, I'm not sure you need fairer for this because everybody agrees that Luke had Mark. So Luke is getting rid of the Markan story regardless of whether he had Matthew or not. He doesn't have to rework it. He's just got rid of it. So the question is, so I love that you threw Mark Dager and I'm like, every case gets included. So cool. But I'm just not sure you need that because everybody agrees with the part. The last thing I'm gonna say is if you're also gonna go to Black feminism in addition to women, I think you're Black feminism. Because I don't know if that's useful at all. Jill Hicks Keaton recently came out with a book called it is called Good Book, How White Evangelicals Save the Bible and Save Themselves. And she presented a chapter on it when we were at Duke, and she said in the whole group, Jesus being a dick.
Oh, wow.
The whole room was like, oh, you know, it was like Joel Marcus and Douglas Campbell, and we're all just like, what? And so I mean, you could go to her too if you wanted. I'm just saying you've got a lot of choices here. And is that what you're trying to say? And is that helpful, or do you just want to stick in one lane? And that's fine. I just throw it out.
So yes, I can do that. I do not want to lose the Black woman's experience in this. And so, but I think using sources from many people is always welcome. So thank you.
Thank you so much for this paper, Kim. I am Leslie Nelson from United or United Lutheran something. Sorry. I don't know if I were. The reason that I have inserted myself next in line is because I have a sort of thought about there's a book from the 90s about historian Sojourner Truth and how it changed over time. Initially, she marketed herself to support herself in various ways. There's the transcriptions of that speech, and people question whether they kind of play up how folksy she sounds. And then also, her story was later used to support voting rights for women by like white women. And so I wonder whether maybe that would be an interesting tie-in for these questions of different presentations of the Syrophoenician woman, to think about how Sojourner Truth's story is used differently across American history.
Okay.
Just an idea or sort of a thought of how that might even tie in further.
Thank you.
She stole it. I was going to tell you that later. Byron Moxie, Villanova University, but yes, the folksiness of, because Sojourner Truth actually spoke in like a heavy Dutch accent, and so she wouldn't have sounded that way. That's the work of a white woman. So it actually would help so much. Well, it's going to help you a lot. But you are doing womanism. This is a womanist methodology, clear and simple. I thought you were going to go with womanist sass, because that the wit, the sass, and you said sass once.
Yeah.
But it's quite clear that's what's happening, and it's the sass that's operating at the level of survival, and navigating across, like, how do you navigate around all of the obstacles that are happening to you? It's really, that is the method. That's the thing that people can critique. The way that Black women have to navigate around foolishness in order to get to the means that they have in this. The story is really, if you bring a Black woman's experience of having to navigate through
everything,
you got it. If you bring that to this reading, you see what any woman that has a similar experience at this time would have heard, would have received through the story. So to mark that out more in terms of method, it would happen. But I see it. The other piece is this issue with Mark. Like Mark, to me, I think to ask this in the last question, which, because it's being written, right after the fall of the temple, Jesus' repeated suggestion us to not fear, to not be afraid, Thurman and me, I know Missy would help you with this. Howard Thurman's column is like, think about fear and how fear is really bringing this Markan story to its thing. And then the idea of like, this is a scripted script. So the thing is, we have the story, but the ultimate goal of the story, I think you're right, for Mark, is to do something. It's like a sermon. It's to call us and challenge us to do something. And it seems to me like what you're inviting us to think about is this one little story that's shocking, because there's obvious discrimination happening on the part of Jesus, is calling us to think about the ways that people outwit our own discrimination, and to think about the ways that our discrimination needs to probably cease, in ways that would mimic the kingdom of God. So it doesn't, to me, if you took this idea of Mark as unfinished, then you don't need to resolve any of this. You can call Jesus a racist, because it's calling us a racist.
Can I just say one thing? Mitzi, I can't help Mitzi Smith. So I didn't want to get too much into, she did a wonderful job with sass. Like, you can't rewrite that. But I wanted to kind of, from her sass, say, she not only sassed Jesus, she backed Jesus up into a corner. Like, what was he going to do? So her sass probably shocked him somewhat, because he tried to be a little funny about it. Like, I'm not even going to talk to you. I'm talking to the disciples. And then she's like, listen, help me. I'll do whatever I need to get you can call me whatever you want to call me. but my daughter needs to be healed. So until you heal my daughter, I don't care what you do. And if you want to throw a riddle to me, well, I'm not who you are used to being around. I'm not who you, because I can figure it out. Like they couldn't, I could. So that's what I was trying to, and which is the Black woman's experience. So that's what I was trying to show.
And fearless.
And fearless, yeah, because you have to. I mean, it's life or death. So yeah.
Again, Joseph Jensen, Georgetown, and Catholic Society. Couple of things. One is honest translation. So in English, what is the proper word for a female dog?
Oh, come on.
No, I'm serious.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
and you know, in terms of what is used to put down women, what are they called?
Mhm.
And so translate this story literally into good English that really will convey what Jesus said. And when I say, wait a second, no, not this, not our Jesus. But when I was about 10 years old, my dad, good Catholic, took me aside and said, now, Eddie, that was my name at the time, you're growing up, you're going to start getting interested in girls. And I was thinking, okay, this is going to be the birds and bees talk. And he said, but the one thing I want you to know is when you decide to get married, make sure that you don't marry a wop or a spick.
What?
So wop is lost from English, and spick is still around. But a wop, we lived in an Italian farming community, and my dad felt that was kind of sad that I was being influenced by Italians. So I pictured Joseph taking Jesus aside when Jesus was about 10. And, you know, don't get involved with those Gentile women. They're horrible mothers. Don't get involved with Samaritan women. They can't be faithful to their husbands. And, you know, that shaped Jesus in the same way that we get shaped by that kind of influence, and so on. To me, part of the beauty of this story is that the woman converts Jesus. And I don't have a problem saying that. Jesus was truly human. And in the same way that I am truly human, and I was influenced by what I was taught, and I had to grow out of it, I still have to let go occasionally of things that I really believe and all. And so in this, you know, so the beauty of this story is this woman love for her daughter, and she will stoop to any level to get that. And so anyway, that's the third thing I would throw in is, yes, Luke leaves this out, but Luke is the only place where you get positive statements about the Samaritans. John doesn't have this picture, but John has the Samaritan woman. And I love it, the Samaritan woman. At one point, Jesus gives up, I've had enough talking to a woman, go call your husband. And I really do think when Jesus says, you're right, you've been with 6 guys, they're married 6 times, and the guy you're with now is not your husband. Jesus didn't know that. Jesus is repeating what he was saying about why to stay away from Samaritan women. That, you know, this is where we see the true humanity of Jesus at its best revealed in the gospel. And for us to rise out of it.
Can I make 2 comments to what you said? As a Black woman, the term bitch is used too often about us. And while there were some of the sources that I read who said that about her, I was not going to stand here in front of a mostly white crowd as a Black woman and say that she was a bitch. I wasn't going to do it.
She wasn't.
Or that Jesus called her a bitch. And to your point earlier, Dr. An, there is still some working out of that sort of thing from my position that I need to do as I continue in this journey. I'm not a PhD candidate, I'm a PhD student, so I'm not a candidate yet. The second thing is while I think she bowed, I purposely said I say she took a knee. I don't think she stooped. I don't think she stooped at all. I think she decisively made decisions about what she was going to do in order to get Jesus to heal her child. And stooping has a connotation of she lowered herself, she lowered her values. I don't think she did. I think she did. There's a saying that's like, you got to use what you got to get what you want. I think that's what she did, but not stooping. I think she bowed. That's why I said took a knee. I think that she purposely did what she needed to in order to get what she needed from Jesus without lowering herself and remaining a woman.
But look,
This is Peter.
Thank you.
Villanova University. Thank you so much for your paper, Kim. Just a few comments. At the beginning of the paper, you used like riddle language. I encourage you to drop that.
Okay.
That's part of a kind of a apologetic, language
Okay.
to defend Jesus.
Okay.
It sort of beautifies what the rest of your paper does not.
All right.
To the second thing is that I want to call to attention Mark 7:29, whereas Matthew ascribes to the woman great faith.
Yeah.
Mark does not.
That's right.
Right?
Yeah.
And I'm not suggesting, because there's a history of scholarship that uses that to say, well, she didn't have faith.
Mhm.
No, but Mark, I think that's different because of this word. Go. And that sort of, it's been read over in the English translations for saying that. No, it's because of these logos, right? So there's scholarship being done on just the power of logos in Mark that actually supports your argument.
Okay. Thank you.
I am afraid we are out of time. You're gonna have to talk to her at 93.
Thank you.
Sorry. Kim, the meeting. Right, it's coffee break time. We will resume at 4:30. Right back here. Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Lisa Deak is a Master's of Theology, and she was a spiritual director in Ohio. And she is in the certificate program in the Department of Theology at Villanova University. Her area of focus is the New Testament, and her paper today is titled God, Impartiality, and Love of Enemies. So welcome, Lisa.
So I have to echo too, it's been very nice here. This is my first CBA paper too, or conference. And it's been very interesting to hear all the different people, and the way you do things is quite interesting, quite diverse too. In 1804, Meriwether Lewis and William Clark were tasked by Thomas Jefferson to explore and document newly acquired Western territories. The success of their expedition depended heavily on Jefferson's extensive map collection, which, despite their inaccuracies and limited scope, served as a crucial tool for Lewis and Clark in planning and navigating their route. Upon their return, Clark created over 140 maps that transformed a previously obscured region into one that could be realistically explored, envisioned, and navigated. Lewis and Clark's expedition and the maps expanded upon existing knowledge and offered new and accurate guides for further exploration. Just as Lewis and Clark had to rely on preliminary maps, first century Judeans had to rely on rabbis and scholars for circumscribed interpretations of Mosaic law and a finite portrayal of God. The representations or maps offered by religious leaders to the Judeans portrayed God as a sovereign ruler who administered justice, rewarding obedience and punishing evil. Judeans in the first century understood God's impartiality primarily as an expression of divine justice, and Israel had the unique ethnic identity and position as God's people. In contrast, the early Christian communities, confronted with the reality of Christ's life, death, and resurrection, were impassioned to reimagine God's impartiality and love of enemies, to reinterpret the meaning of God's chosen people, where there were no insiders or outsiders. This paper argues that the early Christian communities, as reflected in Matthew 5:43-48 and Acts 10:34-35, actively redefine the prevailing understandings of God's impartiality and non-discriminatory love, moving beyond their culturally accepted insider-outsider distinctions. Applying James Allison's forgiving victim model to these passages illuminates how the early Christians reconstrued prior interpretations of God's impartiality and love for enemies to develop a new inclusive framework, offering a more comprehensive foundation for contemporary social justice thought. In Destroyer of the Gods, Larry Horato contends that early Christians in the Roman era demonstrated considerable diversity and distinct behaviors. However, they maintained among themselves a spirit of mutual acceptance despite their differences. They exhibited notable respect for Jewish tradition and did not adhere to exclusionary us versus them perspectives. These early Christians were open to a nuanced interpretation of text assembles following the death and resurrection of Jesus. And some of their contemporaries regarded them as a new race due to their unusual everyday ethical conduct. While the communities responsible for the Gospel of Matthew and the book of Acts experienced internal conflicts and divisions, they eventually succeeded in reconciling their differences to establish a communal identity rooted in Christ. The early Christian identity that emerged after Jesus' death and resurrection was linked to God's creative love amid human violence and death. Theologian James Allison describes God's generous love and forgiveness as embodied by Christ in the crucifixion and resurrection, by depicting Jesus as the forgiving victim. Allison observes that God's response to the crucifixion was completely absent of rancor or retribution, and the resurrection demythologizes God and reveals that God is not in competition with humanity for power or glory. God has nothing to do with any form of violence. The power revealed in the resurrection affirms the reconciling, impartial, self-giving nature of God. Allison's model of the forgiving victim emphasizes that Jesus did not come as a dominant leader intent on dismantling the corrupt world order. Rather, Jesus revealed the futility of human systems characterized by scapegoating and violence against perceived adversaries. His apparent powerlessness was not a passive acceptance of his fate. Instead, he actively modeled a destabilizing love that refrains from reciprocating violence and instead sought to engage humanity in a genuine transformational relationship grounded in forgiveness and an identity defined by God. Jesus was not a doormat to violence, but rather his vulnerability exposed the scapegoat mechanism when he became the ultimate scapegoat and revealed God's power as love without violence. Adopting a new identity poses challenges for anyone, and the early Christians were no exception. They faced the difficult task of shifting from their established Jewish identity as God's chosen people to one deeply rooted in the teachings and person of Christ. The struggle to abandon, revise, and integrate Jewish identity into the teachings of Christ is evident throughout the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew's Gospel is an unusual combination of old and new, where the righteousness of the Torah is preserved in a form of obedience to the teachings of Jesus, and the kingdom of heaven is brought about by Matthew's Messiah. The author of the Gospel of Matthew mirrors our contemporary confusion regarding how we should treat our enemies. Jewish ethical tradition influenced Matthew's understanding of justice. And Matthew straddles between having Jesus condemn the Pharisees in chapter 23 by repeating woe to you statements, and then later in 5 and 7, where Jesus clearly directs his followers to a radical love of enemies and to follow the golden rule. The gospel writer seems to have struggled to arrive at a clear conclusion regarding Jesus' advice on how to handle opposition. 2 points should be noted. First, Matthew's literary style portrays groups as flat characters that function to illustrate a particular trait. The Pharisees symbolize hypocrisy, a behavior to avoid, not people to be disliked and thought of as enemies. The disciples represent people who lack insight and faith, not people Jesus regretted choosing as disciples. The second point to keep in mind is the gospel ends with Jesus' death and resurrection. Matthew's Messiah does not return, condemning those who put him to death. Jesus forgives and offers peace. Jesus returns as the forgiving victim who loves his enemy, not as the dispenser of woe. Matthew's gospel seeks to reveal the message about the long-awaited Messiah and the kingdom of heaven. In Matthew 5:43 through 48, Jesus gives his disciples a preview of what the kingdom of heaven will entail. You have heard it said, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbors and hate your enemies. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This will make you children of your heavenly Father. For he has caused his sun to rise on evil people as well as those who are good. And his rain falls on both the righteous and the wicked. If you love only those who love you, what reward will you receive? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brethren, what about that is so extraordinary? Even the pagans do the same. Therefore, strive to be perfect, just as your heavenly Father is perfect. The hearers of Matthew's gospel are invited by Jesus to transition from the Old Testament understanding of acting with justice within the law towards one's enemies to the self-emptying love embodied on the cross by Jesus, the forgiving victim. As contemporary interpreters of the Gospel of Matthew, we may fail to recognize the concrete actions that Jesus was urging his disciples to undertake. For this community, the threat of violence was real. Their enemies were actively persecuting, torturing, and killing them. And Jesus' command to love one's enemy left no room for exceptions. Finding themselves the object of persecution and unjust violence invited them to deeply reflect on the life and death of Jesus and realize their own complicity as actors in his death. They were able to let go of their false identity as the only chosen people of God and the defenders of justice, and humbly and painfully open to the call of self-emptying love found in Christ. Jesus speaks directly to the reader in Matthew's gospel, and his command to love one's enemy is not an aspiration for the future, but a requirement for discipleship. Although early Christians had faced considerable internal divisions, biases, and disputes, history demonstrates their ability to overcome these challenges by imitating Christ's example. Over time, they learned to practice Christ's self-giving love, thus embracing a new identity within the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:43-48 offers 2 central threads to guide the early Christian communities. God's non-discriminatory love is available for all of humanity, and God has nothing to do with violence. The concept of God's self-giving love, accessible to all of humanity, regardless of their worthiness, is echoed by Luke in Acts 10:34-35. While Matthew urges Christians to adopt the self-giving love model by Christ, Acts 10:34-35 confirms that God's love is impartial and offered to all, irrespective of their ethnic or social distinctions. Then Peter proceeded to speak and said, "In truth, I see that God shows no partiality. Rather, in every nation who fears him and acts uprightly is acceptable to him. You know the word that he sent to the Israelites as he proclaimed peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all." Acts 10 focuses more on Peter's transformation than on the Gentile Cornelius, as Peter needed to reorient his understanding of his own Jewish identity and practices to better align with insights he received from God. Peter's words in Acts 10 give the reader a glimpse into the authentic understanding of God as impartial, non-discriminatory, without insider-outsider distinctions. This was a fundamental paradigm shift for the early Christian community because it required letting go of the Jewish identity as God's chosen people, where the observance of the law was how one was judged by God. By announcing God's impartiality, Peter was opening the community to a new identity, free from the distinction of Gentile and Jew, in which God, in Christ alone, judges without violence. In his book, Broken Hearts and New Creations, Allison observes that when a framework based on accusations and blaming an adversary collapses, the individuals involved struggle because their sense of self was defined by the existence of an enemy. The earliest followers of Jesus Christ initially found themselves trapped in a cycle of violence and scapegoating, interpreting the world in terms of good, evil, insider, outsider. The resurrection of Jesus and his return as the forgiving victim dismantles the system that had previously structured their worldview, leaving them to redefine their new identity. This identity, which was given by God, became the foundation for developing strategies to prevent hostility and division within the emerging Christian communities. At the heart of this process was their willingness to embrace humility and love for their enemies, through which they came to understand themselves as co-creators with God in a community where domination and scapegoating had no place. By adhering to the gospel teachings of God's impartiality and the call to love one's enemies, these early followers were able to navigate the cultural, ethical, and religious divisions, providing a theological basis for social harmony and ethical conduct within the early Christian movement. Rooted in the example of Christ, who broke the scapegoating mechanism underlying human violence and rivalry, the early followers of Jesus were able to live out the teachings reflected in Matthew and Acts. Early Christian communities provide a compelling model for modern social justice thought. The followers of Jesus drew new adherents not because they concentrated on combating evil or because their ethics were unique or exemplary, but because they patterned their lives after Christ. They acted from the understanding that God was for them and no one was truly their enemy, allowing them to respond to conflicts or injustice with humility, forgiveness, and inclusion. By modeling themselves in Christ, the early church in the first few centuries fostered a socially, ethnically, and culturally diverse community whose very diversity strengthened its unity. Although early Christians lived in a social and cultural context very different from our own, human beings remain fundamentally similar in their basic needs and capacities. The following section analyzes the similarities and differences between early Christian social action and modern social justice thought, with particular attention to how their respective goals and self-understanding shaped and directed their mission. For the first and second century generation of Christian believers, the goal was to address injustices through acts of charity, combined with a focus on strong community relationships and moral accountability. They viewed the world as the body of Christ, and their positive influence on the wider culture stemmed from their willingness to engage individuals within the existing social and cultural context, rather than from efforts to obtain political influence. Early Christians focused their actions on areas where they could make a tangible difference, understanding their role as co-creators in a community defined by love, rather than revolutionaries who were dismantling power structures. Their identity, shaped by a belief in Christ and humility, was central to their self-understanding because they recognized they were not the creator. Rooted in this understanding, they sought to view all of humanity from a divine impartiality perspective, which they understood as a doorway to loving their enemies. Love and unity therefore functioned as central aims in early Christian life, and the believers did not regard themselves as morally superior to others. Comparing early Christian approaches with contemporary social justice highlights how differences in goals and identity shape action. Early Christians emphasized impartial love, unity, humility, and belief in Christ. In contrast, modern movements that attempt to mirror the ideas of early Christians have gradually shifted to focus on systematic change, collective agency, and multiple intersecting identities. This gradual realignment of goals and identity has likewise shifted in who social justice efforts center on and what outcomes are expected. These contrasts invite reflection on how conceptions of self, God, and community influence the ways in which injustice is addressed and lived in contemporary culture. Modern Catholic social teaching stems from an encyclical written in 1891 called Rerum Novarum, hope that's saying it right, on the condition of labor, which affirms that every person has inherent dignity, workers have rights, and Leo XIII advocated for the exploration of a third way to balance social tensions between capitalism and socialism. Over the last 134 years, social justice has evolved alongside society. However, unlike the relational and charity-oriented focus of the early Christians in Rerum Novarum, it has strayed from its original goal and has become fragmented, often framing issues in adversarial terms. Systematic changes aimed at upholding the inherent dignity of every individual have morphed into slogans like tax the rich, crush ICE. Collective agency that is striving to address injustices has been reduced to phrases like no kings and FU. And supporting intersecting identities has become synonymous with by any means necessary and no peace for the wicked. This gradual realignment of goals and identity has reshaped both the focus of social justice advocacy and the outcome it seeks to achieve. Efforts to understand and creatively address human and systematic injustices have increasingly given way to name-calling and persecution of a perceived enemy. Although the presence of a common enemy may foster solidarity within a community, it risks devolving into scapegoating systems in which the expulsion of the enemy becomes the central objective rather than the pursuit of justice, reconciliation, and love for one's neighbor. The adversarial tendencies that can emerge in social justice action may be counteracted by recovering the early Christian emphasis on love of enemies, humility, and an identity grounded in God, a posture that is reflected in Brian Robinetti's observation that what is most striking about the way God's creative will shows up in our world is that it does not necessarily seem like power at all. In fact, it may very well appear to us as weakness, at least if our understanding of power is predetermined by a notion of force, prestige, appropriation, and ironclad security. Robinetti's vision reminds us the pursuit of justice need not mirror the dynamics of power and rivalry, but instead can reflect the quiet, transformative character of God's creative will. Sorry, I had to read. I have cut dyslexic, so I have to really read it.
Question.
Who's waiting?
Thank you, Lisa. I'm wondering, when you're talking about the early church.
You introduced
Well, administrator from Villanova University. When you're talking about the early church, where are you getting the information?
I'm thinking from the first 3 centuries.
Right.
And I got it.
Like, where's Irenaeus, where's, Marcion, where's,
I got it from, so I am not a New Testament scholar, and I got it from Donald Hagner, Cornelius Beeman,
where's the dates of this?
Douglas Hare, 1993, 2004, 2005, Larry Hereto, 2016. Yeah, there you go. Ulrich Lutz, 2007, Wayne Meeks, 2003.
Yeah, I think because, I don't think many scholars would say that there was unity or love between Christians for the second, third, and fourth century. I mean, those were really marked by adversarial conflicts and often. So like, you know, we're reading Ignatius or, you know, the Nicomachean texts or Irenaeus or, I'm just not sure that, I mean, it seems almost like we're taking Luke at his word. That we're taking Luke at his word in Acts that everything was harmonious and that everybody was getting along. But I just don't think that from the evidence that we have at our disposal that we can argue that there was any kind of harmony or unity or love or lack of.
So why would the church continue on? Like, why, if there was all this fragmenting, fighting, and how could it, what remnant continued on?
Well, that's called the triumphal orthodoxy. There's, you know, there were many doctrinal ways for centuries and people did kill each other, you know.
But something moved on. The
orthodoxy, it's called the winners.
Yeah.
The winners moved on.
But that,
and the Arians, the Valentinians, the Marcionites all fell by the wayside, and those are the ones who lost. But I don't think there was anything like unity, and orthodoxy wasn't developed until really, you know, we get the 4th century, you can argue, that you got further orthodoxy leading up to that. As we just heard from Matthew Novenson, Origen would have considered himself orthodox, but then he was anathematized. So I just don't think that the unity, I would just encourage you to actually, you know, engage with people like Irenaeus, with Marcion, with the Ebionites, and find out what all of these debates were, because I think that's almost apologetic is the word I'm looking for. It's sort of like looking back to the past of rose-colored glasses, what was actually very fraught with conflict and sometimes killing of each other. I don't think there really was that type of unity in early Christianity which makes it very difficult.
Well, I guess it depends on what you're reading too. I read a thing where who was it? Something with a D. Again, I am not a New Testament scholar. They said that they described the Christians and saying because of their acts of charity, they were they didn't throw. I think it was heretified, maybe. They in the Roman times, it used to be you had a baby, and if you didn't want it, you threw it on a garbage dump. And then the Christians were the ones who said, you know, that's not right. And they also were the ones that when the plague came, they were the ones that stayed in the city and took care of people.
There's so much diversity in early Christianity and so many different opinions about what Christianity was, and some people would have been completely lost with one another. Like, for instance, whether you got to chuck the entire Hebrew Bible in our team and say, goodbye Hebrew Bible, and, you know, a lot of people would say, no, you got to keep the Hebrew Bible. And so, and of course, the Orthodoxy went on that front. But there's no, yes, some Christians definitely argue, but there's no essential group of Christians. There's just a lot of people who argue with one another, and Orthodoxy is the winners of that conversation.
Okay.
So I think it's what's the word? Kind of a projection or rewriting of history to see the word unity in early Christianity. So I'm not, yeah. So I think it's worth looking at folks like, is it Walter Bauer? Walter Bauer's book on early Christianity. That's worth looking into, to seeing all the kinds of diversity of early Christianity theology.
Okay.
Mark Smith. I want to thank you for your talk. It's very brave of you. It's not easy to get up on a bunch of folks like this. So I applaud you. I would like to ask you to tell me, I have a quote from your talk. They viewed the world as the body of Christ. And I found that very intriguing and wanted to know where that came from.
That came from me.
Well, I know it came from you,
Yeah.
but where are you getting it from, I suppose, is what I'm asking. What's it based on, or do they have to
again,
say stuff like this somewhere and I missed it?
No, it is, so, again, everybody views things through their own perspective when they read something, which is evident today with all the different people in the talks. So it was more of my viewing from the stuff that I read when they talked about, I think it was something Dionysus, that they saw Christians as a new race. The things that they talked about led me to understand them in a way that maybe you all disagree with, so.
I suppose really more my question is there some ancient source that is expressing this idea that they viewed the world as the body of Christ? I guess that's what I would.
Not that I know of, and again, I am not a New Testament scholar. This is.
I am not either.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks for the paper. Oh, who am I? Yeah, who are you? Peter Schmitalo, Villanova University. I would encourage you to take a look at, this is not kind of a biblical kind of encouragement. Matthew and Luke, when they talk about love, the enemy, they use agape, right, as the code for that. And I think your paper would be really strengthened by working out what that kind of love actually means, especially with respect to the enemy. And if I understand your project correctly, then there seems to be an urgency for us today to be sensitive towards that kind of prescriptive love that we mean here. And enemy usually implies, somebody afflicts pain. If we translate this even into modern experiences, right, that pain can live very close to oneself. So loving that person who harms me, who hurts me, right, who makes me suffer, is a tricky proposition. So to work out what agape actually means. Is this the kind of Valentine love? Sending hearts and roses?
Yeah, and
does it mean love that forces me, compels me to reconcile? Or is it as kind of a pragmatic love? Right, that keeps the distance, but nevertheless does not return the harm that one received. So it was just this encouragement to look into possibilities of agape.
So I think I'm more theological, like the biblical thing was kind of put on top of this to get underneath. So I am probably in the wrong place to be doing this.
What I'm offering you here is to make your theological argument stronger.
Okay.
By working out the biblical context of agape.
Okay.
Because you may actually walk away with an understanding of agape that may be different from the one that you may be bringing to your paper right now.
Okay.
So this is just an encouragement to just take a look. And by the way, good theology always looks at the Bible.
Yeah.
It starts there.
Yes.
You're not in the wrong place. You're here to learn. You're not in the wrong place. You don't get. And there's a deal of Byron Monty, Villanova University. Theologians are right here with you. And it's you're not in the wrong place. You have to So it's a shared ecumenical source. We all use it. And the question, the question, the method are always on my mind. And I'm just sitting here thinking about the thing that womanism does so well is explain its ethical commitments. And that's why that definition matters so much. Because a womanist womanism is a commitment to a certain ethical, religious, moral endeavor. That's why it can never be just Black feminism. You know, that's just not the same question. And a womanist must choose to say, I'm committed to the survival of all people, of whole people. So the person you're using is Girardian. And there are certain white people.
Yeah, but Girard.
A lot. They don't like express the way womanists do. That's why I'm offering. The way a womanist and a Black theologian will just put it all out on the table. These are my ethical commitments. This is what I'm trying to do. It gets hit. This is my problem with Brian. I know Brian Robinette. so I'm often like, what is the ethical commitment here? You're doing this type of Girardian thing, and it looks all nice to say be a scapegoating and X, Y, and Z, but what's the agenda? What is this accomplishing? Where's this question coming from in terms of the thing? And so it seems to me, and I want to hear about this more as a theologian and ethicist, it seems at the end of the paper, I heard your ethical issue. I heard what was really the problem for you and why you want to go back and retrieve from Scripture a way for us to think about that. So could you just please say more clearly for us what that ethical commitment is?
You just said it right there, but so then you're getting, Girard is a whole nother hole to get down into, because then I don't know if people know who he is, and it's a big explanation to go into Girard and scapegoating analysis. I mean, that's a whole different ball of wax to bring into this environment.
That's fine, they can handle it.
So the thing for me is the scapegoating. It's not seeing the other as part of you and you a part of them. So there's nothing out here that isn't in here. Anything that you can do out there, doesn't matter what it is, murder, abuse, pedophile, I have that same thing. And so to be able to come at least some point to say, I recognize myself and you in the good and the bad. And then there is no other. Then we become, I think I said it in here, the more diverse we are, the more unified we can be, because we see each other and we see the good in each other.
Jensen at Georgetown and the Biblical Society. And one of the most troubling passages for me in the New Testament is in the last book, in the book of Revelation, where it describes the martyrs in heaven, pleading for the time when they can bathe their feet in the blood of those that persecuted them. Now, if that's how we're going to spend heaven, so again, what I'm saying is everything that you said is there. But there's also the other reality of pain and suffering and, in a sense, the desire for revenge or the implication, and that's not automatically removed. And I think there's a reason why that verse is in the book of Revelation as a reminder to us of things were never perfect, even within what we think of what Christian life ought to be about, and for loving our enemies and whatever. If we're going to spend eternity just waiting for the chance to bathe our feet in the blood of those that persecuted us, that's not eternal life that I want to have a part of this. I really understand why somebody that has suffered much more than I would think that.
I'm just thinking about what Byron was saying there and like what your bigger ethical project is. Oh, Gunter, Villanova University. I was just wondering if it might help you methodologically, instead of trying to focus on like what we hope early Christians were like, or what in an idealized way the early Christian movement was like historically. can we shift it methodologically to say what Jesus teaches in Matthew, right? Because I think that we're on a little bit safer ground, because I don't think Christians have ever really had unity or gotten along or been nice to each other necessarily, but Jesus taught. Well, he wanted to be that way, right?
I think it can. You
Oh,
can disagree. Yeah, but we're looking backwards. So
I
anyways.
was saying that it would be methodologically on more solid ground if you were to focus on what Jesus is teaching and keep it there, rather than saying, oh, the early Christians did it right. Because there's a million ways we can show the ways the early Christians did not do it right. And even ways where Acts is clearly like whitewashing the story that Paul tells. So it's like, is this really what happened? But if you just focus on what Jesus teaches, like the Matthew passage, you might be a little bit firmer territory for making the argument and saying this is what Jesus teaches to do, and that thus in Catholic social teaching and in these modern discourses, we can apply this passage from Matthew because that's what Jesus teaches. Methodologically, that might be a little firmer ground.
Okay.
Anyone else? Moving on.
I don't think I got my question answered. And I want you to,
So
as a systematician and an ethicist, just to be clear about in this space, like, what is the concern? Because a systematician speaks today. So we take this stuff, but we're mediating the scriptures and the tradition so that we can speak the gospel rightly in today's context. And I want you to punch it. I want you to just send it home, what you're trying to tell us about today.
What I'm trying to tell, the more, so if I want to start a conversation with you and I start saying people that wear brown shoes are just dumb, that's not a really good way for me to start a conversation with you. And it happens everywhere. Like it happens in political, it happens in social. So it's the starting with, let me tell you how you're wrong. Doesn't start a conversation, or doesn't help any of us grow together. And on a political scale, the idea that if I call you enough names or if I scapegoat you enough, you're going to all of a sudden say, oh my gosh, you're right. That doesn't work. And the thing that I tried to get in here is there is a real power in the humility to say, okay, all right, go ahead. Father Chris had asked me when we were outside, if someone was holding a gun to my husband's head and was going to kill him, what would I do? And here, I would let them, because the violence isn't mine. I didn't start the violence. I didn't hold the gun. And so to retaliate and kill someone that I've never made, I can't make a human being like that. I mean, you can, but you really can't. You need some help. So I guess that's where I'm getting at, is that violence doesn't help us become united in any way. Violence in words, violence in action, violence in thought. It doesn't bring anyone together. And I think there's a real together in this diversity, we would be just fabulous. So, and I do believe, I know I don't have the proof, but I think there were some circles of people that lived this out or had to live it out. It's the Dionysius, he was describing the Christians and he called them a new race, that people were calling them a new race. I have that in here. There had to be something going on.
Sorry, we are out of time.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right.
It'll be a terrible transition from what she finished with.
This is just born.
Josh, how did you line us up like this? Come up here. Still, make sure it's correct. Just back over here. Some people will walk there. Yeah, that's it. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We are
ready for our last afternoon research paper. And it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker, James Garcia, who I believe is a PhD candidate. Yes, in the Department of Theology from Villanova University. James's focus is on the Gospels and just war theory. Very relevant topic today. His paper today is titled Two Swords, the Gospels and Just War Theory. So welcome, James. It's good to have you here.
Right. So like I said, I'm a Villanova PhD student. As you can tell, I started my PhD journey late. Part-time student and self-funded. I would not recommend any one of those things to anybody. But I always thought, with a little bit of hard work, I publish, presented form like this, that one day I'll become the most, at least in Catholic circles, the most famous Catholic who's ever graduated from Villanova. And then last year, of course, realized that's not going to happen. Pope Leo, dream crusher. But as part of this journey, I'm a retired officer from the United States Air Force, deployed to the Middle East. I commanded troops and was a part of the kill chain. Now in retirement, I have a more opportunity to reflect and look at the ethics of conflict, and then connected to just war theory. Josh Ashcroft had said that just war principles are the foundation of the law of armed conflict. That's what I had to operate under as a military member. And our global system of sovereign independent states. I think now more than ever that foundation is being rocked. So I think it's maybe a good time to revisit this topic here. Next slide, please. So as we look to the Bible, some people take different messages away from it. The Bible in general, New Testament in general, and then the gospel. Some come away with a message of pacifism, love one another, turn the other cheek. Some come away with a message of realism, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And just war theory, just war tradition is kind of in between those two. All it wants to do, it's operating in an imperfect world from a secular perspective, or from the religious perspective, a fallen or a sinful world. And we just want to reduce the amount of suffering and destruction on this earthly city. And that's the best we can hope for. Next slide, please. So apart from the top two, so a Greek philosopher and a Roman statesman, everyone else here on this list, contributed to just war theory, drawing from, originally the gospel, Patrician's writings, and others. And then each one drew upon the previous one. So with Augustine, actually Ambrose and Augustine, they started to develop some of the key ideas that are foundational to just war theory. Thomas Aquinas codified them, put them in the Summa Theologica, second of the second, question 40 specifically. Then later on, the Dominican Francisco de Vitoria and other Dominicans and Jesuits from the School of Salamanca in Spain, as the Spanish Empire was spreading literally now around the world, around the globe, the Americas specifically, and they critiqued that spread of that empire based on biblical foundations. And then Hugo Grotius was a Protestant jurist a little bit later on, so more from the legal perspective, developing things that would become international law in the future. And then finally at the bottom there, Immanuel Kant, not just still talking about that international system, but making it directed toward peace, in his words, perpetual peace. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the result of all that, and especially with Kant, Immanuel Kant, and others before that. So we have actual, living documents, treaties, conventions, customary law, not simply theories or abstract concepts. So from beginning with the end of the 19th century, the Hague Conventions, leading into the Geneva Conventions, what you can and can't do in warfare, whether it's to prisoners, people stranded out at sea, which is kind of appropriate lately, or civilians. international humanitarian law, which operates a little bit differently than international human rights law in peacetime. It operates during war. And then the United Nations Charter, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, as you know, Jacques Maritain had a lot of influence in. And then you put all that together, and what does it mean for the war fighter, for the soldier? It is the law of armed conflict that they have to follow, the rules that they have to follow. Next slide, please. And before I jump into the the connection to the gospel, so the two main elements, jus ad bellum and jus in bello, is what has existed for most of the time, these 2 centuries that we've had this. Jus post bello, how to move from a war, how to end it justly, and then move more towards just peace. It was more from Immanuel Kant, and then after that. But under jus ad bellum, right, justification for going to war, those top 3 sub-bullet words there, or concepts, proper authority, just cause, right intention, you have to have that in order to have a just war. Those came from Augustine. And then, like I said, Thomas Aquinas codified them a little bit better. So not anybody can just go to war, has to be declared by a proper authority. There has to be a just cause. And Augustine had quite a few, and then Aquinas narrowed them down a little bit. And then nowadays we just say what's reflected in the UN Charter, and that is defense. If you're attacked, you have the right to defend yourself. That's about the only justification for a just war. And then have the right intent, to restore peace. The next sub-bullet comes a little bit later, but same eventual thinkers here that contributed to it. Your reaction to, let's say, being attacked has to be proportional to what the threat is. You have to have a reasonable chance of success. This can't be a suicide mission. And it has to be the last resort after trying everything else possible, diplomatically, economic sanctions, whatever the case might be, before you resort to arms. Jus in bello only has 2 areas: discrimination or distinction, which involves non-combatant immunity, being able to tell combatants from non-combatants, soldiers from civilians, if you will, and then attacking the ones that are soldiers, just like you, and not attacking and trying to avoid harm to the civilians. Proportionality, there has to be a military necessity for whatever it is that you're doing. You're not just blowing up things and killing a bunch of people. And like I said, jus post bellum, how to move from that more towards a just peace. You're not going to do that by massacring a bunch of people and expect them to be friends a little bit later on. Next slide, please. So the different writers that have contributed to this, and the modern ones, 20th, 21st centuries and all, they usually draw from the same 4 passages from the Gospels here. So John the Baptist's advice to soldiers, come to him and want to know what to do. Jesus' praise for the centurion, which we're all familiar with. The 2 swords is usually used to explain something else as far as here on earth, but just war theorists use it as a particular way. And then the events surrounding Jesus' arrest. Next slide, please. All right, so starting off with Luke 3:14. So here's John. Even tax collectors came to be baptized, and they asked him, "Teacher, what should we do?" He said to them, "Collect no more than the amount prescribed to you." Okay. Soldiers also asked him, "And what should we do?" He said to them, "Do not extort money from anyone by threats or false accusation, and be satisfied with your wages." So here's an opportunity lost. If the message was throw away your swords and don't be soldiers anymore, try being tax collectors. Maybe that's a job to get into. But instead, he doesn't do that. He just simply says, do not abuse the power that you have by being commissioned with the sword, and be content with your wages. And I've been to parts of the world where there are military members that will extort money from you. Next slide, please. So the centurion, a lot of people cover it, or at least 3 of the Gospels do, but and we take away certain things from it. But specifically for just war theory, the part where the centurion replies back to Jesus and says, "I'm also a man under authority with soldiers under me, and I say to one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes." That's both Matthew 8 and Luke 7. And so he's not just a soldier. He's literally, as the title implies, he's in charge of 100 or so soldiers. He's a centurion. Same thing, Jesus misses that opportunity to tell him, don't go to war anymore, don't be a soldier, throw away your sword. And instead of anything, he praises him and saying, nowhere else in Israel have I seen someone of such faith. Next slide. Like I said, the two swords is usually used to justify some other things. But as far as just war theory, here we are at the Last Supper. And Jesus said to them, when I sent you out without a purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? He said, no, not a thing. He said to them, but now the one who has a purse must take it, and likewise a bag. And the one who has no sword must sell his cloak and buy one. So not only just have something, but if you don't have it, sell something you got to get this thing, to get a sword. And he says a few more things, and the disciples say, they said, Lord, look, here are two swords. And he replied, that is enough. So with two swords, you're not going to storm a Roman garrison or anything like that. But I'm guessing there's maybe about 12 apostles here. There might be, one might have been gone by this point, but around 12 individuals and two swords. Among them, it's about 16%. Like I said, they're not going to be taking over anything, but they should be able to maybe defend themselves. And that, once again, gets back into what made its way into the UN Charter as far as what would you consider a just war, something in defense. Next slide, please. All right, so everybody's talking about this part over here. Mark probably has the least to say that anybody really draws upon. He says, but one of those who stood near drew his sword and struck the slave. And then Jesus goes on to say that, have you come with swords and clubs to arrest me, as though I were a bandit? So he's not even addressing what happened with the sword and cutting off the ear or anything like that. But he does make this analogy that I guess if he were a bandit, then it would be okay to come at him with swords and clubs. Perhaps if you were an enemy attacking a particular country, I'd be justified then in defending ourselves and my people with swords and clubs. But moving on to Luke, and those who were about him saw what would follow. They said, Lord, shall we strike with the sword? Doesn't seem to answer that. And one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, no more of this. And he touched his ear and healed him. So that kind of gets into what Immanuel Kant was talking about with use post bellum. How do you get to a just peace and move away from a war? One of those things is restoration, and in this case, healing. John 18:10, Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's slave and cut off his right ear. Jesus therefore said to Peter, put your sword in its sheath. In other words, the sword does have a place. Don't just throw it away, but it's in its sheath for the most part. And then finally, Matthew, then Jesus said to him, put your sword back in its place, for all who take the sword will perish by the sword. So here's where you think, okay, now I got you. If you're a soldier with a gun, sword, whatever the case might be, if you live by it, you're going to die by it. But most of the time, the interpretation from the just war theorists is that there is a difference between taking the sword, because you're angry, you're mad at somebody, heat of passion perhaps, and being commissioned to carry the sword. If you're a police officer or a law enforcement officer or a centurion, a soldier or something like that. And there's a big difference. You're protecting the people. You're not just acting it out, taking the sword because you're angry. Next slide, please. So this is not something, a passage that I've seen with any of the just war theory writers that I've read, but I figured, well, let me take a shot at this, right? I think I can practice some exegesis here and try to tease a message out of this. So this is Luke 14:31, and Jesus was just explaining the cost of discipleship. Uses an example. What if you're going to be building a tower and you didn't sit down at first and estimate all the cost? You get about halfway done. You run out of money, you run out of supplies, and your tower isn't completed. The second example he uses is, or suppose a king, so we have proper authority, as Thomas Aquinas and Augustine had said, is about to go to war against another king. Won't he first sit down and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one coming against him? So someone's coming against him, I must be on the defense. right? So defending me or my people is one of the justifications for going to war, not attacking somebody, but defending. Against him with 20,000. So 10,000 versus 20,000. This gets into the chances of success as well as proportionality, those aspects of just war theory. If he is not able, he will send a delegation, so last resort, before you actually have a clash of arms. There might be one other way to work this out, while the other is still a long way off and will ask for terms of peace, which should be the object of a just war. So John Courtney Murray, next slide. And this I just thought was kind of cool looking. Had said that the function of just war theory is, quote, to condemn war as evil, limit the evil it entails, and humanize its conduct as far as possible. So in the just war tradition, there's this continuum that runs through the Gospels, draws from them in an effort to at least limit the destruction of war on this earthly city or in this earthly city and achieve just peace, or just a peace as possible.
Thank you. Thank you, James.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.
I'm Archie Wright from the Catholic Biblical Association.
So, based on your criteria of authority to go to war, the concept of defending yourself makes just war. Is the United States currently at a just war?
I knew I was setting myself up with that one. I do want to answer that,
Before this happened, though.
which is true. And then I watched the Venezuela. I go, oh, this is not good. And then I watched the Iran thing. But then I thought, but still, this is the perfect time to talk about this. I'm going to answer that by when Augustine was talking about what makes for a just cause, he included a lot of things, including defense, retribution, reclaiming territory, punishing another power or king in his case, for doing something. You got to remember at the time he's writing, that literally the enemy's at the gates. Roman Empire is dissolving, and the barbarians are at the door. What he would call barbarians are at the door. And then Thomas Aquinas kind of reduced those to a defense and maybe one other one. And then finally, by the time it makes its way to the 20th century, we have the defense. You have to, just like a human being has a right to defend themselves. So in human rights law and in the law of armed conflict, you have the right to defend yourself as a country. To answer your question, I think it's how that proper authority in this case defines defense. For Vladimir Putin, there was this big threat from Ukraine because there was Nazis there and they were going to join NATO, and that was too much of a threat, so he attacked. He actually followed the rules that are outlined in the UN Charter to report, hey, I'm defending my country, Russia, against Ukraine, and he at least cared enough to put up a front to make it seem like he was following just war theory and the UN Charter to say that. In our case, I think our government tried to make the same claims, that there were threats to either us or our allies from what was going on there, which wouldn't be that far off, except that those threats were minor and they've existed for decades. So. Thank you. Oh, we got a question from them. Are you allowed to ask questions?
Actually, I normally don't, just because what's your name? My name is Joshua Scott from Oxford University and the Catholic Biblical Association. Thanks so much for your paper.
Sure.
It is timely. And a really important discussion that I don't think, as biblicist, or I'll even say as teachers, that we think about as much. This comes up in my undergrad classes periodically when we read passages from the Hebrew Bible, and we use the word genocide sometimes to talk about behavior, and we have to populate that word with meaning. My question for you, how do you define war? Is it a skirmish? And, or I forget the word being thrown around in the news today, and forgive me because I can't remember the exact word. Conflict, there are words to minimize the action. And I'm wondering that, because I think that, especially in our modern context, people are getting around the concept of just war theory, or getting around the need to justify their actions because they're not defining it as a war. So I don't mean to be facetious with this question.
That's a good one.
I am concerned, just war theory also assumes integrity and justice within those definitions. And what happens in our post-democracy context when those are no longer values that we seem to hold on to within some forms of leadership? Just war theory kind of goes out the window. You no longer need justification. So how do you define war, and how do you define war in the context where we're, I'll say, post-justice, post-integrity, those are no longer central concerns? Is it just, can you say that just war theory is separate from imperialism? Or is it always attached and that can never be separated from the claim of land, the claim of economics?
Michael Walzer wrote the book Just and Unjust Wars, and a lot of subsequent just war theories refer to that often. And what they talk, so I'm going to use their term to answer your question, and they define it as a quantum of force. So you can't quite, you know what it is when you see it, but you can't quite define is how many people have to die, how many tanks have to blow up. It's hard to say, but like you said, there's a skirmish, there's a border crossing, incursion or something like that. And then there's an all-out war. I don't think that just war theory was meant to put it in a box and say, this only applies to this. It's any kind of conflict, even between starting with two people and then expanding from there. So, and a lot of times that's the example that they use mainly on the law side, international humanitarian law, is the same type of thing that exists between two people, exists between two countries, two nations, or in this case now, could be like a terrorist group and a nation. It's a good question. Eddie.
Can I follow up real quick and just say?
Oh, you have your mic?
Yeah, sorry. I didn't hear the second question that I had.
Oh, what was it?
How can you talk about just war in an age where it seems like integrity and justice we've moved past that in some way as founding elements?
Yeah, could you respond to the second question?
So that St. Augustine had said that even a just war is cause for remorse. So this wasn't a template or a checklist to say, okay, check, just war, I'm feeling good now. We should feel remorse, and I think that's what's missing. I think we had it a couple of administrations ago where, we had to do what was necessary, or what we felt was necessary, but we really did beat ourselves up about it. There were reports commissioned to look into, what had happened, so, we can self-critique ourselves. I don't see that happening now. And in fact, some of the commissions that were created were just, I would say definitely within the past year, were dissolved. And the people that were in those, the ones that are left don't really have a mandate. That might get a little closer to answering that question. Yeah. So we're not feeling that remorse that we should.
So one of the things too, Joe Tenson from Catholic Biblical Association and from Georgetown University, that when you talk about proper authority, what about individual decision? So in my case, I graduated from undergraduate, had a fellowship at Drew University in Biblical Studies for PhD, everything paid, and within a month I was drafted. And I refused induction, pled guilty, had 3 years taken out of my life, and it wasn't all that bad. I got sent, I was sentenced to 3 years in Forest, Colorado, reported when I was 22, and almost on the bus to take it there when 3 limousines showed up. Men in black suits got out and came and they hadn't chained me. took me back over the judge, and I ended up spending 3 years working at the University of Colorado Medical Center. Ended up with a master's degree in library science. Classes in the history of medicine. I started teaching history of medicine. I teach history of medicine at Georgetown. All of those good things happened to me. And it took a while to figure out. Wait a second, if I've been Black, if I was Hispanic, all these, I am totally the beneficiary of being white and male and all of that. But with the judge initially and the prosecutor brought up just war.
Oh.
And I said, I'm Catholic and I know just war. My undergraduate major was philosophy. I said, but from what I can see, if I'm going to fight following the just war theory, I need to be on the other side. She didn't give me any favors as such. I will say, years later, I decided to go to Nicaragua 14 times and live in villages in the midst of the fighting, deliberately as a US citizen there, unarmed, with the idea that if something happens to me, it's not going to look good. I went to El Salvador 3 times. And all. So I've been in the midst of some horrible fighting, whatever, and wishing the ground would open up and swallow them and all. So now I'm 81 and I've lived through it all. And I've never had a sense that the just war as a whole made sense. And partially because it takes some, it takes away my choice in terms of just because my government, and Catholic, technically a Catholic using Catholic just war theory does not qualify for conscientious objection. And all these other things that stand in the way of it. So I've been very much involved in this for a long, long time. But I did have this very strong sense that anybody like you that was going to be in the military and believed in it and all in favor of it. And my own sense was that you were going to do that with your life. I needed to be able to do the same in terms of going to Nicaragua and try and live in the midst of it and experience and be part of it. And it's not exactly the same. And I didn't have weapons, whatever. I have this very strong sense that we have to be able to stand up for justice and take risks for it, but not be willing to kill for it.
Yeah, Thomas Aquinas did address that when you have, because once again, proper authority is what you need. Augustine said it, Aquinas agreed, but he said, and I think Augustine did not agree. Aquinas said that, however, if you're dealing with tyranny, right, the government is there to protect us, right, the common good, Thomas Aquinas used that term. But if they're not doing that, then we have tyranny, and you are allowed to rebel against tyranny. So, but as far as proper authority, I think most of them, especially the early writers, just wanted to separate that from improper authority, just somebody getting a band of people together and going to launch some acts of violence.
So instead of getting my doctorate in scripture at something like 28, I didn't make it until age 60, but I stood out there.
You're right. You're my inspiration.
Thank you. Great job. I'm Nathan Bruce, Villanova. I guess I don't have a fully fleshed out question, but your use of like parables as an inspiration for just war theory, and obviously like in specific and medieval sources, like you can kind of do that working around, but I would just imagine like if you took Paul's, put on the armor of God, the shoes of peace as, that translates into a just war theory. I do wonder if there's like, we're expecting the weight, the weight of just war theory to be carried by scripture in these like kind of parable examples as a way of leading out just war theory. And obviously, it becomes a larger philosophical question. But I wonder, on one hand, I appreciated this kind of like spread of scriptural examples in the New Testament to examine different distinct points in which war and violence is talked about. But I do wonder how much scripture in those examples can carry the weight of like a just war.
Yeah, those are the four ones that I highlighted are the ones that I've seen in all the different writings. The one I used as the last example I've never seen. I just kind of threw that out as, let me take a shot at this. And I think it's because like a lot of us that look for guidance and we say, boy, if only Jesus would say this exact thing that pertains to me.
Jim, can you come back towards?
That pertains to me, just say it, Jesus, don't go to war. Some our soldiers are bad, like they're like even tax collectors are better, but he doesn't. So they try to just pick out whatever they can with those examples, with the swords, with the centurion, with the soldiers that go up to John the Baptist. So.
What do you do about that early patristic prohibition against being a soldier? How do you respond?
Well, most of the writers, when they look at that, they say, a lot of the reasons why, like Tertullian, Origen, well, actually, quite a few of the early writers didn't want Christians to be in the military was because of their pagan rituals that they had to partake in. Basically, the emperor was God, the emperor was their God, and then all the other rituals that kind of went along with that more than anything else. In fact, they said you can support the emperor and support the soldiers therefore, but not fight yourself because of that. So
it's a thing through idolatry.
Is what that was one of the key reasons. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it was where the emperor was God, and then some of the other rituals, and they just kind of worked in different things with the Roman gods.
I'm just thinking.
Yeah.
We do that. And we find the underlying concern is idolatry, and that never makes it into just war theory. That at a certain point, a war is yes remorse, but like you should absolutely not take part in this at all if it actually is idolatrous. If the war making itself is idolatrous. How do you respond to that? That's my reading of it. That's all.
So when I had the one slide up that had pacifism on the one side, and then the pacifists would say, "Oh, Jesus just wanted us to, be peaceful, turn the other cheek, and all." And even the early Christians, wouldn't be soldiers. But then others would say, "Well, wait a minute. The reason they weren't soldiers is not because they didn't want to be violent or kill or not love one another." Sorry, but because to be a Roman soldier, you'd have to follow all those other rituals, things like that.
Yes, and I'm just, and if we can take that, it's extra biblical, it's social and all. But to take that criteria and then take this example from early church history and then say, what would this look like? What would it look like in our present situations for war to be idolatrous? Like, you see what I'm saying? Like, what are some criteria for us to think through? Because then it would be a strict prohibition. You are not allowed to take part in war that leads to idolatry. And not in the sense of like, bow down to, but idolatry shows itself in a number of ways. And so I'm just offering that up as like a more constructive move. Like, let me go grab some to answer the people that want a clear prohibition. When is this absolutely wrong?
Mm-hmm.
And to me, I think the answer is Tertullian. When you're worshiping another god, and what does that look like for us to outline some criteria in just war theory, so that we have a prohibition within a theory and not just remorse.
Yeah, and I think then what made it more complicated was with Constantine, and then Christianity being not persecuted, then accepted, then promoted, and then now that was an actual advantage to being in the military.
Somebody claiming they were convicted?
Villanova University. Lisa talked about love your enemy earlier. What would you say if I were to argue that just war theory is just an intellectual attempt to bypass Jesus' freedom to love the enemy?
So all I can give you is the two perspectives, one from Augustine, one from Aquinas. And Augustine said, you will be showing love to your enemy the same way you would to your child when you reprimand them. You want to stop them from doing the bad thing that they're doing, so you're going to forcefully stop them from doing. I'm showing you love the enemy. Aquinas didn't quite go that same way, but his was the what was it called? The double effect. Yeah, right. So what you're doing is terrible, but as long as it doesn't outdo the good that you're doing, then it's okay. I'm saying that wrong, but it's along that idea, and that's where it shifts from Augustine. Yeah. Yeah. So it's still bad, but it's counteracting the worst bad. I guess that's what it is. That's what
It's still in terms of Jesus.
Yes.
Well,
I mean, this is my question to you.
No. And I'm thinking of the different reading I had and the different writers that had that same problem. A lot of them dealt with this mental exercise, with the Good Samaritan. What if the Good Samaritan came up on the individual that he helped, not after he was robbed, beaten, laying down there, but as he was being robbed? What would he have done? There's not a real answer to that, but you kind of have to, mental exercise, think about what could he possibly have done to save this guy from getting beaten or killed by these robbers. It's more thought-provoking than worthy of an answer.
On the other cheek, walk the extra mile.
So, and that's the other thing that a lot of the writers would point out, that even Jesus, when he earlier said, if you get struck on your cheek, turn the other cheek. Yet when he was literally struck on the cheek after his arrest by a soldier, he didn't turn the other cheek, he admonished him. And he said, for what is it that you're hitting me? What crime have I done?
Gospels.
Yes.
God's Jesus is different.
Only you would point that out, but yes, it is true. It is true. Yeah. But that's what, now I don't agree with that, but that's how they would defend that. So not that leaves you in a better place.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Eddie again. Twice.
Joe Jensen again. Another thing that comes up that is, what about my role as a civilian in a country that is in a war, and is that a just war? And what about the taxes I pay and all of that? I can say from my own experience, don't try war tax resistance. You end up giving the government far more money.
Well, that kind of ties in. Was it Brandon or that ties into your question, where the early patristic writers would say, I'm not going to participate in your stupid idolatrous army, but I'm going to pray for victory or pray for the emperor. So you can do your work over here, donate blood or raise food or whatever the case might be, or even for refugees, people that are affected by a war or a conflict, not necessarily the soldiers. What are you saying?
Except to run around with Caesar.
Run around with Caesar. What else? Everybody's getting hungry.
No.
Where's the priest? I'm sure he would have another question.
All right, well, I'm out of my death conscious for a period, but here we go. Do you think the just war theorists or the Bible have anything to say about, transnational corporations as actors in war?
So that's
Which is an example that we have in the 21st century, and most of these models certainly seem to be talking about people and nations.
Yeah. And that's where it does need some updating. You're absolutely right. It had needed updating when we had terrorist groups that were operating out of other countries, because normally you would have insurgent groups in your own country and you're fighting them. You have the ability to do that. But even before 9/11, then we had a terrorist group, but they're not in the United States, they're in this other country that we're not at war with. So that, we had to try to figure that out. But then the whole transnational corporations, I don't think anybody was even thinking about that. Certainly not when they were writing all these things here. But there are some, like, what was it,
They fund some wars in.
They certainly promoted them and benefited by some. Yeah, absolutely. I thought you were going to go with some of these corporations that basically have their own private armies, like Halliburton and all.
Point is, it goes back further than more recently.
Yeah, but it does need updating. It's not just two countries like World War II, fighting with tanks and planes and things like that.
So Archie, right? Did Augustine talk about what appears to be in scripture where God is doing somewhat unjust wars against Israel's enemies, where he's
So in the Jewish tradition, they don't have just war theory. They simply have wars that are ordained by God and then other ones. It's not really refined, but that's what they would point to. What's in our Old Testament? Yeah.
So how would we classify them now?
Give me an example and maybe I can.
Well, like whenever God decides to slaughter.
We will not allow the Amalekite to live.
Yeah.
So you do see those arguments made today. So a lot of times it's just like the more Machiavellian, realist theory that, we're being attacked, we have to defend ourselves, or, this country is, choking off our economics and we need to do something about it. But then there's others at the other extreme that will say, we have a God-given right to either this territory or to wipe out these people or to push out, coast, closer to the coast, whatever the case might be. Yeah, that's tough. That is tough. Oh,
So
last question.
I'm also a captain in the United States Army.
Yeah.
But I was thinking about that. The minute I knew immediately what was happening when they tried their best to change the name of the Department of Defense, which most people don't realize. That change is rooted in this the change of the name of the Department of War and Department of Defense.
Yeah.
Rooted in our consciousness of realizing the only reason for war is for defense. And so it really is just the silliest thing ever to go back to the Department of War. But I'm actually about to write something on.
I was gonna say I knew the conversation, but I'm in agreement with you.
Just peace, which is now the more stuff that's a more dominant framework among Catholic theologians. The CTSA group, we're fighting for that more so than just war. And I just wanted to hear what you had to say. You mentioned just peace in this in the last post-bellum piece, but the concept now has just gone so much farther. I'm actually proposing, one of the things I'm going to do before I leave this earth is to ask the government to change the Department of Defense to the Department of Peace Building, and to really fight for that, because it just.
Well, if you remember, depending on how long you've been in, that part of our missions had changed from just simply, World War II, Iraq, to peacekeeping.
Building webs, starting schools, doing, eliminating the need for an enemy through this type of peace building thing. So, but I just want to hear what you have to say to this just peace movement that is already.
It's funny because I want to agree with it so much, and I did a paper. Okay, I did a paper on use post-bellum, how to get from a just war to finishing and get to a just peace. And I was just, I got very, very frustrated. In Vatican II, Gaudium Spes, it says it says peace is more than just the absence of war. But man, from what I've seen all over the world, there are a lot of people that would say, just give us absence of war right now. We'll work on a just peace later on. Now that's not a good answer, right? But I just feel you can work on just peace, after that, just stop shooting at people. So, sorry. All right.